Good evening, and welcome back to another long, slow drift through history. Tonight we're traveling to a country most people think they already understand. The calm, endlessly courteous nation perched above the United States like a patient older sibling. Canada, home of maple syrup, hockey rinks, and an almost pathological instinct to say sorry. But here's what almost nobody outside its borders realizes. Underneath that gentle reputation is a past that is anything but calm. There are ships buried in Arctic ice that took over a century to find. There is a gold rush that emptied entire towns overnight. There is an explosion so massive it remained the largest man-made blast on the planet until the atomic bomb arrived. And yes, there were Vikings, wandering onto these shores 5 centuries before Columbus ever set sail, only to shrug, pack their bags, and go home. Before we settle in, a quick and genuine thank you to everyone who requested this particular journey through the comments. Your suggestions genuinely steer what gets made here, and this one was impossible to resist. If tonight's story helps you drift off, a like and a subscribe are always appreciated, though only if you're actually enjoying the ride, never out of obligation. And do leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is right now for you, because somehow, no matter the hour here, it's always 3 in the morning somewhere else. This channel is also available on Spotify now, so if you'd rather close your eyes completely and just listen, that link waits for you below. And for those of you who crave something even longer, there's a standalone extended cut available exclusively to members, built for the nights when even a long story isn't quite long enough. Now, lower the lights. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background for that soft wash of white noise. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders and let's begin. Ask yourself this before we start. Why would an entire nation end up named after something that was essentially a mistranslation? Could you paddle a canoe for 16 hours a day, day after day, surviving on nothing but cornmeal and rendered fat? Could you spend a winter alone in a one-room cabin in the far north, feeding a fire you were never permitted to let go out? And did you know that, less than 100 years ago, the law did not consider women to be legal persons in this country? How does a nation with such a soft-spoken reputation carry a history this turbulent underneath? You've just crossed the longest undefended border on Earth, and you're about to find out that the polite country with the colorful currency has a past soaked in ice, fish, blood, and gold. Let's begin. Long before anyone in Europe had heard the name Columbus, a small band of Norse sailors hauled their longships onto a rocky, wind-battered shore in what we now call the northern tip of Newfoundland. This was somewhere around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus supposedly discovered a continent that was, of course, already very much inhabited. At a site now known as Elance Aux Meadows, these Norse settlers raised sod-covered halls, hammered out iron nails in a makeshift forge, repaired their vessels, and became, as far as we know, the very first Europeans to set foot on North American soil. And then, after a handful of difficult years filled with cold, conflict, and homesickness, they simply left. No grand farewell, no lasting colony, barely a written record. Try to imagine the moment itself. Weeks spent crossing open ocean in a wooden boat, soaked through, sharing cramped quarters with livestock, navigating by sun, stars, and no small amount of hopeful guesswork. And when you finally step onto solid ground, there's no welcoming committee. Just bog, wind, stunted trees, and the slow, sinking realization that you've sailed an enormous distance only to find somewhere even colder than home. This wasn't paradise. This was survival with interest. And yet they built. Archaeologists have since uncovered the remains of 8 separate timber and turf structures, along with a small forge where local bog iron was worked into tools and nails. There's even evidence of a workshop, which is a strangely civilized thing to bring to the very edge of the known world, rather like moving into a remote wilderness cabin and immediately installing a fully stocked garage. The old Norse sagas, passed down by word of mouth for generations, describe a place they called Vinland, a land of wild grapes, wheat that seemed to grow on its own, and rivers so full of salmon you could barely see the riverbed. For hundreds of years, historians treated these tales as little more than folklore, the sort of exaggerated story a relative tells after one drink too many. Then in the 1960s, a husband-and-wife team of Norwegian explorers followed the old sagas almost literally and found the physical remains buried beneath the Newfoundland turf. The legends, it turned out, had been telling the truth the entire time. Nobody had simply cared to check, so why did they abandon it? Nobody can say for certain, but the sagas offer some strong hints. The winters were unforgiving. The supply chain stretching back to Greenland and Iceland was dangerously long, and relations with the people who already lived there, whom the Norse referred to, none too kindly as Skrælings, eventually turned hostile. When you're outnumbered, isolated, and increasingly unwelcome, the wise move is to load the ship and leave, which is precisely what happened. Here's the detail worth smiling about as you settle in tonight. The Vikings, a people whose entire cultural identity is built around loud, dramatic conquest, stumbled onto an entire continent, thought it over for a season or two, and decided it simply wasn't worth the trouble. No flag planted, no grand declaration, just a quiet retreat and a handful of stories nobody believed for centuries. It might be the most understated first contact in recorded history, and in hindsight, it feels almost like a preview of the famously restrained country that would eventually rise from these same shores. But while the Norse gave up on this land, another group of Europeans would arrive centuries later with a much stronger reason to stay. And that reason wasn't gold or glory or land. It was fish. Let's talk about the cod. In 1497, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, a man history remembers as John Cabot, reached the coastline of what was almost certainly Newfoundland. What he found there would shape the next 4 centuries of history. Cod, not simply a healthy population of fish, but shoals so dense off the Grand Banks that sailors claimed you could lower a woven basket over the side of the ship and pull it back up completely full. Word of this discovery spread across Europe faster than news of any goldfield. Long before anyone cared about beaver pelts or farmland, it was this humble, unglamorous fish that first drew European fleets across the Atlantic toward Canadian waters. Now, cod doesn't sound like the foundation of an empire. It isn't glamorous. Nobody has ever composed a sweeping symphony in honor of a fish that mostly just floats there looking faintly unimpressed by everything. But you have to understand the Europe that Cabot sailed from. This was a continent bound by strict religious calendars, where the devout were forbidden meat for well over 100 days each year, every Friday, all of Lent, and countless holy days besides. On those days, people still needed to eat. More often than not, that meant fish. A virtually limitless supply of cod wasn't a novelty. It was a fortune waiting to be claimed. The real genius of cod, and the reason it outpaced every other fish, was how well it preserved. Split it open, pack it in salt, dry it in the sun and wind, and you're left with a hard, flat, faintly overpowering slab that could survive for months and travel anywhere by ship. Think of it as history's original non-perishable protein bar. If that protein bar announced its presence to an entire room before you even opened the package. Rehydrated in stews and broths, it fed sailors, soldiers, farmers, and the devout across an entire continent. Every summer, fishing fleets from England, France, Portugal, and Spain crossed the Atlantic to work the Grand Banks. They built temporary camps along the coastline, splitting, salting, and drying their catch on wooden racks called flakes before sailing home with holds packed to bursting. For decades, this was the entirety of Europe's relationship with the land itself. Nobody wanted to settle permanently. Nobody wanted to build towns. They wanted the fish, and then they wanted to go home, a pattern that, if you're paying attention, keeps repeating itself in this story. The scale of it is almost impossible to picture today. Fishermen reported that the cod were so thick they physically slowed the boats down. Entire economies rose on the back of this one unremarkable creature. Ports grew wealthy, merchants grew wealthier, and the cold, fog-drenched waters off Newfoundland became some of the most valuable fishing grounds anywhere on the planet, all built around a fish most people alive today couldn't identify in a photograph. There's a quiet, bitter irony worth sitting with here. A resource everyone assumed was inexhaustible turned out to be nothing of the sort. Centuries of relentless fishing eventually accomplished what no storm ever managed. In the 1990s, the cod stocks collapsed so severely that the fishery had to be shut down almost entirely. An industry that had helped launch an empire simply ran dry. But in Cabot's time, none of that was even conceivable. The ocean seemed endless, the future looked bright, and Europe was thoroughly hooked. And where the fishing fleets went, explorers soon followed, including one particular Frenchman whose famous mix-up would end up nomming the entire country. Let's get into that. Here's a fact that delights Canadian schoolchildren to this day. The country's very name is the result of a misunderstanding. In 1535, French explorer Jacques Cartier was navigating up what we now call the St. Lawrence River, when his indigenous guides gestured toward a nearby settlement and used the word Kanata, which simply meant village or a gathering of homes. Cartier assumed they were nomming the surrounding territory as a whole. The name took hold, spread across maps, and gradually came to label a landmass nearly 10 million square kilometers wide. An entire nation, the second largest on Earth, carries a name that originally meant something closer to that little settlement over there. To grasp just how strange this mistake really was, picture a confused tourist pointing at your neighbor's front door and asking what it's called. Your neighbor helpfully answers house, and somehow that single word becomes the permanent name of your entire country, coast to coast, forever. That is, in essence, exactly what unfolded here, except stretched across thousands of kilometers of forest, mountain, and tundra that Cartier hadn't even laid eyes on yet. Cartier had been guided up the river by two young Iroquoian men whom he had, in a decision that has aged extremely poorly, effectively kidnapped during an earlier voyage. These were the men using the word Kanata, and they were almost certainly referring to one specific village, Stadacona, near what is now Quebec City, a single settlement, a dot on an enormous, largely unmapped continent. Cartier recorded the word in his notes as though it described the entire surrounding region, and European mapmakers, who had never set foot anywhere near the place, happily copied it down as fact. From there, the name did exactly what names tend to do when nobody bothers to double-check them. It spread. It crept steadily outward from one map to the next, each cartographer copying the last, until a word describing a single riverside village had stretched to cover half a continent. By the time anyone might have thought to question whether this was really the appropriate name for such an enormous territory, the ink had long since dried across generations of maps, and there was, frankly, no walking it back. There's something almost poetic about all of this. Other nations gave themselves grand, deliberate names, titles dripping with ambition, often borrowed from conquering kings or mythic heroes. Canada, by contrast, ended up essentially named Village, applied by accident, by a man who misheard two people he never should have taken from their homeland in the first place. It's humble to the point of being funny. A geographic superpower wearing the name tag of a small settlement that no longer even exists, and somehow it fits the personality that followed. This isn't a country named after a warrior or an emperor. It's named after a cluster of homes, a gathering place, somewhere people simply live together. If you set out to design an origin story to match a reputation for quiet, understated modesty, you could hardly do better than an entire nation calmly agreeing to be called the little town over there, and never once making a fuss about it. Cartier himself didn't stay long enough to build much of anything. He'd come looking for a route to Asia and for gold. He found neither. He did load his ships with worthless quartz and iron pyrite, genuinely convinced he'd struck diamonds and precious metal, and sailed home to no small amount of embarrassment. The land itself would have to wait for someone with a steadier, more realistic business plan. As it turned out, the real fortune wasn't in imaginary diamonds at all. It was in fur, and it would soon be controlled by a company older than the country it operated in. 1670, a handful of English investors secured a royal charter to launch a fur trading enterprise, and in doing so, they unknowingly created what would become the oldest continuously operating company anywhere in North America, the Hudson's Bay Company. At the height of its influence, this single business didn't just sell blankets and beaver hats. It effectively governed a territory called Rupert's Land, a region so vast it covered nearly a third of what is now modern Canada. A private company, answerable to shareholders sitting comfortably across the ocean, controlled millions of square kilometers of forest, river, and frozen tundra, long before any Canadian government existed at all. Let that sink in for a moment. Before Canada was ever a country, before it had a flag, a parliament, or even a name that made much sense, a massive portion of it was legally owned and operated by what was essentially an extremely ambitious retail chain. Imagine falling asleep one evening and waking up to discover that a third of your entire nation was now being managed by a business whose primary interest in you was whether or not you had any beaver pelts to trade. That was the reality, and it persisted in one form or another for roughly 200 years. The whole operation rested on a single animal and a single European fashion craze. Across the ocean, gentlemen had developed an obsession with hats made from felted beaver fur, prized for being durable, water-resistant, and satisfyingly expensive. European beavers had already been hunted to near extinction, but here was an entire continent absolutely overflowing with them. And so the beaver, an animal whose life ambitions extend no further than gnawing wood and building dams, became the unlikely cornerstone of an economic empire. Its pelt was so central to trade that the company used it as a literal currency. Prices were measured in units called made beaver, based on the value of a single high-quality pelt, and you could purchase a kettle, a hunting knife, or a wool blanket, all priced according to how many beaver pelts they were worth. The company established trading posts, which it called forts or factories, scattered across the wilderness like a chain of remote, freezing convenience stores. These outposts became meeting points where European traders and indigenous nations exchanged goods, and it's worth stating plainly that the entire fur trade depended completely on indigenous knowledge, skill, and existing trade networks. The English newcomers had no understanding of the land. They didn't know how to survive its brutal winters, how to trap efficiently, or how to travel its river system safely. Their entire profitable enterprise rested on partnerships with the people who already possessed all of that knowledge. The scale of the company's territorial reach is difficult to overstate. Rupert's Land was named after Prince Rupert, a cousin of the English king and the company's first governor, and it encompassed every river system that drained into Hudson Bay, an area so enormous its boundaries weren't defined by lines on a map, but by watershed geography alone. That's how you describe land when there's simply too much of it to measure with any precision. You gesture broadly at an entire drainage basin and call it a day. Eventually, in 1870, the newly formed nation of Canada purchased Rupert's Land from the company outright, quietly acquiring roughly a third of its future territory through a straightforward business transaction. A country buying back most of itself from a private corporation isn't exactly the dramatic founding story you'd see dramatized on a movie screen, but it fits the pattern remarkably well. And remarkably, the company itself never actually disappeared. It shed its territorial empire, pivoted into department stores, and simply carried on. For generations afterward, you could walk into a Canadian shopping mall and buy a pair of socks from a business that had once governed a third of an entire continent. Few empires fade away quite so gently, or with such a generous returns policy. Of course, none of that fur made its way to the ships on its own. Someone had to physically haul it out of the deep interior, and those people held what might be the single most punishing job in the entire economy. Meet the voyageurs. Picture a job where your daily routine involves paddling a birchbark canoe for 14 to 16 hours straight, hauling loads heavier than your own body weight across muddy portage trails, and surviving on a diet of cornmeal, dried peas, and rendered pork fat that would horrify any physician today. This was the life of the voyageur. These were the men who physically powered the fur trade, hauling trade goods and furs thousands of kilometers into the continent's interior and back out again. They became famous for their extraordinary endurance, their brightly colored woven sashes, and their constant singing, filling the vast northern silence with rhythmic paddling songs, partly to lift morale, and partly to keep every stroke perfectly synchronized. Let's start with the paddling itself, because it almost never stopped. A voyageur was expected to maintain a stroke rate of roughly 40 to 60 strokes per minute, hour after hour, from before sunrise until well after sunset. Do the math on that, and you arrive at tens of thousands of individual paddle strokes in a single day. Your own demanding workday might feel relentless, but you've likely never had to dip a paddle 50 times a minute, while the man behind you belts out a folk song about a lost love, daring you not to fall behind the rhythm. Then there were the portages. Rivers don't connect neatly and conveniently. Every so often the water became too shallow or too violent to navigate, which meant the entire canoe and its cargo had to be physically carried overland to the next stretch of navigable water. Cargo was packed into standardized bundles weighing around 90 pounds each, and a voyageur was expected to carry 2 of these bundles simultaneously, one strapped to his back and one balanced on top, held in place by a leather strap stretched across his forehead. That's roughly 180 pounds of fur and trade goods, jogged at a steady trot across jagged rock, thick bog, and mosquito swarms so dense that period journals describe them as their own kind of weather. Some particularly ambitious voyageurs carried 3 or even 4 bundles at once, which says less about job requirements and more about a genuine cry for help. The diet was engineered purely around caloric density, with absolutely no concern for flavor. In the eastern trade routes, meals consisted of corn mush boiled together with pork fat into a thick, heavy paste. Further west, the staple became pemmican, a dense mixture of pounded dried meat and rendered fat, occasionally studded with berries as the closest thing to a luxury available. It was extraordinarily efficient fuel, packing enormous energy into a compact package, and it kept these men moving through days that would break most modern workers within hours. By most honest accounts, it also tasted roughly like despair compressed into a solid brick. And here's a detail that always catches people off guard. Voyageurs tended to be short. This was by design. A tall man simply took up too much valuable cargo space inside a loaded canoe. Nobody was hired for their height or their reach. They were hired for their shoulders, their legs, and their sheer willingness to endure a working life that would have broken most people within the first week. Many started this work as teenagers and were physically worn out by middle age, their bodies wrecked by hernias, chronic joint pain, and the accumulated punishment of decades spent hauling impossible loads. So why all the singing? Because when your work is this brutal, morale isn't a luxury item, it's essential equipment. The songs set the pace, kept every paddle stroke synchronized across the crew, and transformed an unbearable grind into something communal and shared. Across the overwhelming silence of the northern wilderness, the only human sound for 100 kilometers in any direction might be a canoe full of exhausted men harmonizing about a sweetheart waiting back home. There's something strangely beautiful about that, pushing through genuine misery on a raft built of shared song. These men physically opened up the interior of an entire continent through nothing but raw muscle and music. But not everyone crossing the Atlantic came to paddle. Some came to build families instead. And the story of how that happened remains one of the more unusual recruitment campaigns in recorded history. By the 1660s, the French colony strung along the St. Lawrence River had a serious problem. It was overwhelmingly populated by men, soldiers, fur traders, farmers, and had almost no women to speak of. And a colony without families was, quite simply, a colony that would eventually cease to exist. So the King of France did something remarkable. He personally sponsored the passage of roughly 800 young women, many of them orphans or drawn from impoverished families, to cross the Atlantic and begin new lives in New France. History remembers them as the Filles du Roi, the King's daughters. Today, an extraordinary number of French Canadians can trace their family lineage directly back to these determined young women. The colony's math simply wasn't adding up. By some estimates, men outnumbered women by roughly 6-1, which isn't really a functioning population. It's a wildly lopsided hockey roster with nobody in the stands to cheer. Without families, there would be no children. And without children, the entire French colonial project in North America would quietly age out and vanish within a generation or two. Officials back in France studied the numbers and arrived at a fairly obvious, if slightly startling, conclusion. They needed to send women, and they needed to send a great many of them. So the French crown essentially stepped into the role of a state-sponsored matchmaking service. The women selected for this program were mostly young, unmarried, and poor, many of them orphans raised in charitable institutions around Paris. In exchange for undertaking this frightening transatlantic voyage, they received passage across the ocean, a modest dowry, and in some cases, supplies to help establish a household once they arrived. In a very literal sense, the king was paying to populate an entire continent. The crossing itself was no pleasure cruise. Weeks spent at sea aboard cramped, damp, disease-prone ships, seasick and afraid, sailing toward a land they had only ever heard about second-hand through rumor and hearsay. Some of these women didn't survive the journey at all. Those who did stepped off the ship into a colony defined by punishing winters, relentless physical labor, and a curious surplus of one particular resource: eligible bachelors. It's genuinely difficult to overstate the courage this required. These were young women, many barely out of childhood themselves, wagering their entire futures on a one-way voyage to the very edge of the known world. Once they arrived, courtship moved quickly, because the colony had little patience for slow, lingering romance. Marriages were often arranged and finalized within mere weeks of a woman's arrival, and to their credit, these women were far from passive participants in the process. Historical records show they actively interviewed potential suitors, asked pointed, practical questions about a man's land, his house, and his future prospects, and were entirely willing to walk away from an arrangement if the man in question turned out to be lazy, unkind, or living in a shack unfit for a family. Given that they possessed something the colony desperately needed, these women held more genuine leverage than you might expect, and they used every bit of it. The results were staggering. These roughly 800 women became, quite literally, the founding mothers of New France, and their descendants today number in the millions. If you happen to meet someone with deep French-Canadian roots, the odds are genuinely good that somewhere in their family tree sits one of these young women, who crossed an entire ocean armed with a small dowry and an extraordinary amount of nerve. Entire branches of North American genealogy trace directly back to this single, deliberate act of royal policy. It's a founding story built with no battles and no conquest at all. Just 800 courageous young women and the quiet, patient work of building something new from nothing. And for a colony that had known far too much conflict with its neighbors, a rare and genuine moment of peace was about to arrive, negotiated not on a battlefield, but around a table in a muddy frontier settlement. That story deserves to be told properly, too. In 1701, in the growing, mud-caked town of Montreal, something extraordinary occurred that rarely survives into the more dramatic retellings of history. Peace. Representatives from the French colony and roughly 40 distinct indigenous nations, many of whom had spent generations locked in bitter, bloody conflict, gathered together to negotiate. After weeks of formal ceremony, speeches, gift exchanges, and painstaking cross-cultural diplomacy, They signed what became known as the Great Peace of Montreal. It represented an enormous and delicate diplomatic achievement, bridging cultures and languages, and it brought lasting calm to a region that had endured far too much bloodshed for far too long. History, as it's typically told, has a genuine weakness for the dramatic. Battles inspire paintings. Sieges inspire songs and legends. A treaty patiently negotiated over weeks by people determined not to kill each other tends to earn, at best, a single forgettable sentence in a textbook. If it earns any mention at all, which is a real shame, because pulling this off was arguably a far harder achievement than winning any battle. Anyone can start a war, ending one permanently across dozens of nations who have spent generations grieving their dead. That's genuine mastery. The sheer scale of the gathering was remarkable. Delegations traveled to Montreal from staggering distances, from the Great Lakes region, from deep in the continental interior, hundreds upon hundreds of representatives converging on a single frontier town. Picture the logistics involved. Roughly 40 distinct nations, each carrying its own language, its own customs, and its own long list of accumulated grievances, all arriving to camp around a settlement that was, at the time, little more than a fortified village with ambitions well beyond its size. The town's population swelled dramatically during the negotiations. Simply feeding everyone became its own diplomatic challenge. At the heart of the entire process were the traditions of indigenous diplomacy, which the French had come to understand they needed to respect if any of this was going to work. This wasn't a matter of one side dictating terms on a piece of paper for the other to sign. It involved lengthy, formal speeches, the ceremonial exchange of gifts, the ritual smoking of the calumet, and the careful, patient language of consensus building. Grievances had to be voiced. The dead had to be acknowledged, and, in a symbolic sense, mourned and laid to rest so the living could move forward together. One figure particularly worth remembering is Conderonk, a brilliant Huron-Wendat leader and orator whose diplomatic skill proved central to the entire negotiation. He was, by every account, a formidable speaker and a shrewd strategist, and he worked tirelessly to bring all the various parties to the table. Tragically, he fell seriously ill during the negotiations and died before the agreement was fully finalized, having delivered one final, powerful speech from a chair, because he no longer had the strength to stand. He spent the very last of his energy arguing for peace. Few people receive a finer epitaph than that. When the treaty was finally signed, the various delegation leaders marked it with drawings representing their respective nations, animals like the crane, the bear, and the beaver standing in as signatures. It brought a genuine and lasting calm to the region. The near-constant warfare that had plagued the area for generations eased considerably. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't resolve every underlying tension forever, because no treaty ever fully does. But it held, and it spared countless lives that would otherwise have been lost to an endless cycle of raids and retaliation. It stands as proof of something we too easily forget, that the harder, quieter, more patient path, choosing to sit down and talk instead of choosing to fight, isn't weakness at all. It's one of the most difficult and genuinely courageous things any group of people can accomplish. It simply rarely earns a statue. But not every chapter that followed carried this same hopeful tone. Only a few decades later, an entirely different kind of decision would be made about a peaceful people, and it remains one of the most sorrowful episodes in this land's history. It needs to be told honestly and without embellishment. In 1755, British colonial authorities began the forced removal of the Acadians, French-speaking settlers who had farmed the fertile lands of the Maritimes for multiple generations. Families were torn apart, homes were burned to the ground, and thousands of people were loaded onto ships and scattered across distant colonies. This event, remembered as the Great Upheaval, tore apart a peaceful farming community that had wanted nothing more than to be left alone to live their lives. The Acadians had lived along the shores of the Bay of Fundy for well over a century. They were, for the most part, skilled farmers who had engineered an ingenious system of dikes to reclaim rich tidal marshland for growing crops. They had put down deep roots, raised families across many generations, and developed a distinct culture and identity all their own. Crucially, throughout the long tug-of-war between France and Britain over this contested territory, the Acadians had consistently tried to remain neutral. They wanted no part in the empire's quarrels being fought over their heads. They simply wanted to tend their fields in peace. That neutrality, in the end, was not something they were permitted to keep. As tensions between Britain and France sharpened toward open war, British authorities demanded the Acadians swear an unconditional oath of loyalty to the British Crown, one that could potentially require them to take up arms against their own French relatives. Holding firmly to the neutrality they had maintained for decades, the Acadians refused to swear the oath in that unconditional form. And so a decision was made to remove them from the land entirely. What followed was a deliberate, coordinated deportation campaign. Men were summoned to local churches and meeting halls under various pretexts, and once gathered, informed they were now prisoners, and that their land and livestock had been forfeited to the crown. Families were herded onto waiting ships. Amid the chaos and overcrowding, husbands were separated from wives, parents torn from children, some of them never to see one another again. Their homes and farms were deliberately burned, ensuring there would be nothing left for them to return to. The dikes they had built with such painstaking care were left to fail and flood. The ships carried these displaced families in every direction, to British colonies further south, to England, to the Caribbean, and eventually some found their way to France itself. Many did not survive the journey at all, lost to disease, shipwreck, and the sheer misery of the crossing. Those who did survive arrived as unwelcome strangers in unfamiliar places, dispossessed and grieving, forced to rebuild their lives from absolutely nothing. Over the years that followed, thousands were displaced in this manner. An entire people scattered to the winds. Remarkably, some eventually found their way to Louisiana, where the existing French colonial presence offered a measure of refuge. There, far from the marshlands they had lost forever, they slowly rebuilt a community and a culture of their own. Over generations, the very word Acadian, worn down by time and shifting pronunciation, softened into a new name for these transplanted people: Cajun. The vibrant Cajun culture of Louisiana today, its music, its cuisine, its language, carries within it the living memory of that long-ago expulsion from the North. For those who eventually returned to the Maritimes, or who scattered elsewhere across the region, preserving Acadian identity became its own quiet act of endurance. That this culture survived at all, after being so deliberately and violently broken apart, stands as a testament to the people who carried it forward. This isn't a story to be dressed up or softened. It's one to sit with honestly, a peaceful community that asked only to be left alone, and was denied even that. It deserves to be remembered plainly and truthfully as we move forward into the events that would soon decide the fate of the entire continent. In 1759, on an open field just outside the fortified walls of Quebec City, the fate of an entire continent was settled in a battle that lasted barely longer than a lunch break. British forces under General Wolfe had spent an entire long, frustrating summer trying to crack open the fortress city and failing. Then, in a daring nighttime maneuver, they scaled the surrounding cliffs and assembled on a farmer's field known as the Plains of Abraham. The clash that followed was astonishingly brief, perhaps 15 minutes of actual fighting, and yet by the time it ended, both commanding generals lay dying, and the future of French rule across North America had effectively collapsed. To appreciate just how strange this outcome was, you need to understand the buildup. British forces had been camped outside Quebec for months, lobbing cannon fire at the city walls, burning the surrounding countryside, and generally making no real progress at all. Quebec sat high atop a rocky promontory, protected by steep cliffs and heavy fortifications, and it was proving frustratingly resistant to any direct attack. General Wolfe himself was unwell, irritable, and rapidly running out of both time and options. As summer wore on and the threat of an early freeze approached, he needed a decisive victory, and he needed one before winter forced his fleet to sail home in disgrace. His eventual solution was audacious to the point of recklessness. Under the cover of complete darkness, he ferried thousands of troops downriver and had them scale a steep, narrow path up the cliffs at a location the French had left only lightly defended, confident that no army would be foolish enough to attempt it. It was the sort of gamble that either earns you eternal glory or gets your entire force wiped out in the dark. Soldiers hauled themselves and their equipment up the treacherous slope through the black of night, and by morning, to the absolute astonishment of the city's defenders, a full British army stood assembled on the open field above Quebec. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, made a fateful decision in that moment. Rather than remaining safely behind his fortified walls to await reinforcements, he chose to march his troops out and meet the British in open combat. It may well have been the wrong call. Out in the open field, the disciplined British lines held their fire with remarkable patience as the French advanced, then unleashed a devastating volley at close range. The French formation shattered almost immediately. What had taken months to assemble was effectively over in roughly the time it takes to eat a meal. Both commanding generals fell in the fighting. Wolfe was struck multiple times and died on the battlefield itself, reportedly living just long enough to learn that his side had won, a detail that reads as either strangely poetic or deeply unfortunate, depending entirely on your perspective. Montcalm was mortally wounded as well and died the following morning. 2 commanders, 2 empires, 1 modest field, and it was all decided before lunchtime. History doesn't often move quite this fast, and rarely with such tidy, tragic symmetry. The consequences, however, were anything but small. The fall of Quebec marked the beginning of the end for French colonial rule in North America. Within just a few years, France would cede the vast majority of its territories, and the entire trajectory of the continent shifted permanently. A brief, chaotic quarter hour on a farmer's pasture rerouted the future of millions of people who weren't even alive to witness it happening. It's a humbling reminder that history's biggest turning points don't always announce themselves through long, dragged-out campaigns. Sometimes, they're over almost before they've truly begun. But the story of the 2 founding peoples of this land was far from finished. And roughly half a century later, they would find themselves defending these same shores together against an invasion arriving from an entirely unexpected direction. Speaking of which, ask most Americans about the War of 1812, and you're likely to receive a blank stare in response. Ask a Canadian, and you may well get a proud grin, because this is the war in which British and Canadian forces, alongside crucial Indigenous allies, famously marched into Washington and set fire to public buildings, including the residence we now know as the White House. The conflict itself was messy, confusing, and ultimately concluded more or less exactly where it had begun. But it left a lasting impression on the Canadian imagination, as the moment a young, vulnerable colony successfully defended itself against an invasion from the south. The war began when the young United States, frustrated with British trade restrictions and the practice of forcibly impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy, decided that the obvious solution was to invade the British colonies to the north. There was a widespread American assumption at the time that conquering these territories would be, in the memorable phrasing of one prominent politician, a mere matter of marching. The locals, it was confidently believed, would surely welcome their liberators with open arms. This turned out to be one of history's more optimistic miscalculations. The locals, as it happened, did not welcome them at all. The defense of the northern colonies rested on an unusual and effective coalition. British regular soldiers formed the backbone of the defense, but they were joined by Canadian militia, ordinary farmers and townsfolk taking up arms, and above all, by indigenous nations who clearly understood that an expanding United States posed a direct and existential threat to their lands and their survival. Leaders like the great Shawnee chief Tecumseh played a decisive role, and his alliance with British forces proved absolutely crucial in holding the line during the early campaigns. Without indigenous allies, this story would almost certainly have ended very differently. The war itself unfolded as a chaotic series of raids, sieges, and battles fought across an enormous frontier stretching from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. Fortunes swung back and forth repeatedly. Cities were captured and burned on both sides of the conflict. And in 1814 came the moment that lives longest in popular memory. British forces, acting partly in retaliation for an earlier American burning of the colonial capital at York, now known as Toronto, marched into Washington and set the city's public buildings ablaze. The president's residence was among them, its walls scorched black by the flames. A popular story claims it was later painted white specifically to cover the fire damage, giving rise to the name it carries today, though historians point out the building was already commonly referred to as white even before the fire occurred. A good story, it seems, dies hard regardless of the facts, after all the burning and bloodshed. The war concluded in a manner that's almost comically anticlimactic. The resulting peace treaty essentially restored everything to precisely how it had stood before the fighting began. No territory changed hands. The borders remained exactly where they'd started. If you tally up the strategic gains achieved by either main combatant, the honest answer is roughly nothing at all. Thousands of people died in a war that ultimately returned the map to precisely where it began. But the group that truly lost the most were the indigenous nations who had fought so hard to defend the frontier. Their hopes of securing a protected, recognized homeland and of permanently halting American westward expansion were quietly abandoned during the peace negotiations. Tecumseh himself had already been killed in battle, and with his death died the dream of a united indigenous confederacy strong enough to hold the line indefinitely. The great alliance that had done so much to defend these shores was, in the end, left with essentially nothing to show for its enormous sacrifice. For the northern colonies, though, the war became something of a founding legend. A scattered, badly outnumbered population had faced a full-scale invasion and had not fallen. It planted an early, stubborn seed of a distinct national identity, a growing sense of being decidedly not the country to the south. And out of that same war rose one of the most beloved folk heroes in the entire national story, a woman, a warning, and a very long walk through dense forest. Let's follow her journey. During that same conflict, one of its most enduring legends belongs to a woman named Laura Secord. In 1813, having overheard American officers discussing plans for a surprise attack, she set out on foot to warn nearby British troops. Her journey stretched roughly 30 kilometers through swamp, forest, and enemy-occupied territory, undertaken on a brutally hot June day, and almost certainly in footwear entirely unsuited to the terrain. She reached the outpost in time. Her warning was heeded, and the resulting ambush became a Canadian victory. For generations afterward, her name lived on somewhere between documented history and folklore before eventually, and rather strangely, becoming attached to a famous brand of chocolates. Let's properly set the scene, because the details make this story so much richer. Laura Secord was not a soldier, a spy, or anyone the American officers had any particular reason to be wary of. She was a settler woman in her late 30s, managing a household in the Niagara region while her husband recovered from wounds sustained earlier in the war. The area was under American occupation at the time, which meant enemy soldiers were routinely quartered in local homes, including, as fate would have it, in hers. Soldiers who talked freely, apparently never considering that the quiet woman serving their dinner might be listening very carefully indeed. What she overheard was a detailed plan for a surprise attack on a nearby British outpost. And here is precisely where an ordinary person becomes a legend. She could have chosen to do nothing at all. Staying quietly at home was the safe, sensible, entirely survivable option. Instead, she decided that someone had to deliver a warning. Her husband couldn't physically make the journey himself, and so, by necessity, it would have to be her. She slipped out of her house and set off on foot across roughly 30 kilometers of hostile countryside, entirely alone. Now, 30 kilometers on a paved road with good footwear and a bottle of water is a serious undertaking for most people even today. Attempted in the punishing June heat, through swampland and dense underbrush, dodging active American patrols, wearing the delicate fashion footwear typical of the early 1800s, footwear designed for absolutely nothing more rugged than a garden path, and you begin to grasp the true scale of what she actually accomplished. She waded through thick mud. She fought her way through tangled undergrowth. According to some accounts, she lost her shoes entirely at some point along the way and simply pressed on regardless. The heat alone would have broken a lesser resolve. There's a particularly wonderful detail in certain tellings suggesting she deliberately took a wildly indirect route specifically to avoid enemy patrols, turning an already difficult journey into a genuinely exhausting odyssey. By the time she finally stumbled out of the woods and reached the British forces and their indigenous allies, she was, by every account, utterly spent, scratched, filthy, and severely dehydrated. But she had delivered her warning successfully. The British were forewarned, an ambush was carefully prepared, and the resulting engagement went decisively in their favor. Her walk had genuinely, materially mattered. And then, in the grand and thoroughly frustrating tradition of unsung heroes everywhere, she was promptly forgotten for decades. No reward, no formal recognition, no public fanfare of any kind. It was only very late in her life that her story finally began attracting real public attention, and only after her death that she was fully embraced as a genuine national heroine. She never lived to enjoy the fame while it might have actually improved her circumstances, which is, unfortunately, a very familiar shape for stories exactly like this one. The final twist is almost too perfect to be believed. Long after her death, a candy company adopted her name and likeness for their line of chocolates. And so, for many people today, Laura Secord is primarily known as a box of confections sold at the checkout counter, rather than as a woman who very nearly walked her feet raw to help change the course of a war. It's an unusual kind of immortality, being remembered chiefly through a candy display, but remembered she certainly is. That same war also revealed something larger about this land, a place where crossing the border from the country to the south didn't represent danger, but rather freedom itself. For thousands of people, north meant liberty. Let's follow the road they traveled to find it. For thousands of people fleeing enslavement in the United States, the word Canada carried no connotation of a foreign country. It meant freedom, plain and simple. In the decades leading up to the American Civil War, a secretive network of hidden routes and safe houses known as the Underground Railroad stretched steadily northward, and its ultimate destination was very often Canadian soil, where slavery had already been formally abolished. Towns across what is now Ontario became genuine havens for people who had risked absolutely everything to reach them. Here, families who had legally been treated as property could finally live, work, worship, and build lasting communities as free people, some of which continue to exist to this very day. The Underground Railroad, despite its name, was not a literal railroad. And it certainly wasn't underground. It was something far more remarkable, a loose, secretive web of routes, hiding places, and courageous individuals, both black and white, who helped freedom seekers make their way steadily north. The vocabulary of railways became its coded language. Safe houses were called stations. The people who guided travelers along the route were called conductors. The escaping men, women, and children were referred to as passengers. It was an entire hidden vocabulary constructed specifically to move human beings toward liberty, right under the noses of those actively trying to drag them back into bondage. The journey itself was almost unimaginably dangerous. Freedom seekers traveled predominantly by night, navigating by the stars, moving carefully through swamps and dense forests and across rivers, constantly at risk of capture. Professional slave catchers actively pursued them. And after certain federal laws were passed, Even successfully reaching a free northern state no longer guaranteed safety, because escapees could still be legally seized and forcibly returned to enslavement. This is precisely why so many pressed on, all the way to Canada. Only by crossing that final international border could they be truly and permanently beyond the reach of a system that claimed legal ownership over them. Canada wasn't simply north of the border. It was the finish line itself. The scale of courage required here genuinely defies easy description. Imagine setting out with almost nothing to your name, no map, no certainty of success, leaving behind absolutely everyone and everything you'd ever known, walking hundreds of kilometers through openly hostile territory guided by nothing more than whispered directions and the fixed position of the North Star. Many made this journey while caring for young children. Many attempted it again after previous failed attempts and the brutal punishments that followed capture, and still they went, because the alternative, remaining enslaved indefinitely, was simply unbearable. One figure towers above this entire history, and she absolutely deserves to be named here. Harriet Tubman, having successfully escaped slavery herself, returned again and again into extreme danger specifically to lead others to freedom. For a period of time, she based her operations out of the Canadian town of St. Catharines. She proved to be a conductor of extraordinary skill and nerve, and by most historical accounts, she never once lost a single passenger under her guidance. She personally guided people all the way across the Canadian border, into lives permanently beyond the reach of slave catchers. Her courage is genuinely difficult to fully comprehend even now. The communities that eventually grew from this wave of migration were real, substantial, and lasting. Across towns throughout what is now Ontario, formerly enslaved people built homes, established churches, founded schools, farmed the land, and raised families in genuine freedom. They created newspapers, launched businesses, and built lasting institutions from the ground up. Some of these communities, and the direct descendants of the people who founded them, remain in place to this very day, a living link back to that extraordinary passage toward liberty. It's worth being fully honest that arriving safely in Canada did not mean arriving in a place entirely free of prejudice, because it certainly was not. But it did mean freedom recognized under the law, the permanent end of living under threat of being owned by another human being, and the genuine chance to build a life entirely on one's own terms. For people who had personally known the alternative, that distinction meant absolutely everything. The people who found freedom here were actively building something lasting. And soon, the scattered colonies surrounding them would attempt to build something too, though in a manner so remarkably calm and orderly it barely resembles the founding of a nation at all. It happened, of all places, around a conference table. Most nations are born through fire, forged in the crucible of revolution or war. Canada, fittingly, was largely assembled through a series of remarkably polite meetings. Throughout the 1860s, representatives from several separate British colonies gathered across a string of conferences to discuss the possibility of uniting into a single, unified country. There were extended debates, careful compromises, and an enormous amount of painstaking negotiation over matters like railway construction and political representation. On the 1st of July, 1867, the Dominion of Canada officially came into existence, not with the sound of a musket firing, but with the quiet stroke of a pen. It remains, to this day, one of the quietest national births anywhere in the modern world. Think for a moment about how most countries typically come into being. There's usually a revolution, a bloody war of independence, a dramatic declaration read aloud before cheering crowds, perhaps a heroic figure dramatically mounted on horseback. There's bloodshed, there are martyrs, there are stirring speeches destined for the history books forever. Canada looked at this entire template, considered it carefully, and in the most characteristically Canadian move imaginable, decided to skip all of it and instead schedule some meetings. Very productive meetings by most contemporary accounts. The whole arrangement came together across a series of conferences held in different locations. There's something genuinely charming in the fact that one of the earliest pivotal gatherings, held in Charlottetown, was originally organized to discuss a much smaller regional union among the maritime colonies alone, and representatives from the larger colony of the Canadas essentially invited themselves along to pitch a far bigger idea. There's a persistent and rather delightful tradition suggesting the entire affair was thoroughly lubricated with champagne and warm hospitality, and that a considerable amount of genuine nation-building was assisted along by a distinctly convivial atmosphere. Whether or not that's strictly accurate in every detail, it certainly fits the overall vibe perfectly. The actual negotiations themselves were, frankly, focused on the rather unglamorous machinery of governance. Who would hold which powers, how the different regions would be represented in a new parliament, how existing debts would be divided and shared, and crucially, the matter of railways. An enormous portion of the entire deal hinged on firm promises of railway construction to physically bind these far-flung, disconnected colonies together. Because a country that cannot travel efficiently between its own component parts isn't really much of a functioning country at all. It's genuinely difficult to imagine a founding conversation less like storming a fortress and more like an intensely focused board meeting about long-term infrastructure spending. There were real, substantial disagreements throughout, and real compromises had to be made. Different colonies carried different interests, spoke different languages, and harbored different fears about being politically swallowed up by their larger partners in this new arrangement. The framework they eventually settled upon attempted to balance a reasonably strong central government against meaningful protections for regional and cultural differences, an arrangement carefully designed to hold together a diverse and genuinely enormous territory without leaving anyone feeling entirely steamrolled in the process. It was messy and imperfect, as all such compromises inevitably are, but it worked well enough to endure across the following century and beyond. And so, on the 1st of July, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was formally born. There was no war of independence involved, because the new country remained meaningfully tied to Britain for a long stretch of time afterward, gaining full and complete independence only very gradually, over many subsequent decades, once again primarily through careful paperwork and polite legal evolution rather than any dramatic rupture. The new nation began its existence with just 4 provinces and an enormous amount of largely unmapped, empty space that it fully intended to eventually fill. It's easy enough to gently mock the sheer quietness of it all, but there's genuine wisdom buried in this approach. A country assembled primarily through negotiation rather than bloodshed begins its national life, with a deeply ingrained habit of compromise already built into its foundation. It's a founding entirely in keeping with the national character that would follow, a nation that came into being by patiently talking things through, splitting the bill fairly, and shaking hands warmly over the details of a railway budget. But not everyone was invited to sit at that particular table, and not everyone consented to having a new country built directly across their ancestral homelands. As the young nation pushed steadily westward, it ran headlong into a distinct people with their own established rights and their own determined leader, and that collision would prove to be anything but polite. As the young country expanded westward, it collided directly with the Métis, a distinct people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, who had built a thriving, self-sufficient culture across the prairies over generations. Their most prominent and famous leader was Louis Riel, a passionate and deeply complicated man who fought tirelessly to protect Métis land, language, and fundamental rights against a distant government that seemed determined to simply ignore them. He led 2 separate resistance movements, established a functioning provisional government, and was ultimately executed for treason in 1885. To some Canadians, he remains a traitor. To To many others, he stands as a genuine hero and a founding father of the province of Manitoba. His complicated legacy remains among the most fiercely debated in the entire country's history. To properly understand this conflict, you first have to understand exactly who the Métis were. They were not simply indigenous, and not simply European, but a genuinely new and distinct people, forged across generations by the fur trade, with their own unique language, their own traditions, and their own way of life deeply rooted in the prairies and the seasonal buffalo hunt. They had established communities, farms laid out in distinctive long, narrow strips along the riverbanks, and a strong, unified sense of themselves as a nation in their own right. And then, quite suddenly, the young federal government far to the east purchased the vast western territory out from directly underneath them, and began dispatching surveyors to carve up the land into a rigid grid, without so much as a single conversation with the people already living there. Try to imagine this situation from the Métis' perspective. Complete strangers arrive and begin methodically measuring out your existing farms into a rigid grid pattern that completely ignores the way you've always actually lived, operating under the authority of a distant government you never consented to in any way, clearly preparing to hand your ancestral land over to a wave of incoming newcomers. The Métis responded in the only reasonable way available to them. They organized, they resisted, and they firmly insisted on being properly consulted about their own future. Louis Riel emerged as their natural leader during this crisis, an educated, eloquent, and intensely devout young man who could clearly articulate their grievances and stand up confidently to the distant authorities. The first resistance, centered in the Red River region, proved largely successful in achieving its core aims. Riel established a functioning provisional government, negotiated directly with federal authorities, and the eventual result was the creation of the new province of Manitoba, complete with certain formal protections for Métis land and rights written directly into law. For this achievement, many rightly consider him a genuine founding father of that province. But the entire affair was seriously stained by the execution of a troublesome prisoner under Riel's provisional government, an act that made him a deeply hated figure among many in eastern Canada and ultimately forced him into a long period of exile. Years later, he returned for a difficult second act. The Métis, who had since moved further west, were facing the exact same pressures all over again. Their land was once more under threat, their formal pleas once again largely ignored. They sent word for Riel to return, and he came back to lead them once more. This time, in 1885, the resistance escalated into open armed conflict. The federal government, now able to move troops rapidly westward along its newly completed railway, crushed the uprising fairly quickly. Riel ultimately surrendered and was put on trial for high treason. The resulting trial was, and remains to this day, deeply controversial. His own defense lawyers wished to argue that he was not of sound mind at the time, but Riel himself firmly refused to accept that particular defense, insisting instead on the fundamental justice of his cause. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Despite widespread public appeals for mercy, particularly from French Canada, which viewed him as a genuine defender of a French-speaking Catholic people under threat, the sentence was ultimately carried out in full. His execution split the country sharply along cultural lines and left deep wounds that took multiple generations to even begin properly healing. So was he a traitor, or was he a hero? The honest answer is that the question itself has genuinely evolved significantly over time. For a very long stretch, the official historical view cast him firmly as a rebel and a criminal. Today, he's far more widely honored as a courageous defender of his people and a legitimate founder of Manitoba, a tragic and deeply principled figure who stood up firmly for the rights of a systematically ignored people. His legacy remains complicated, genuinely contested, and very much still alive in contemporary Canadian discourse. The very railway that allowed the federal government to ultimately defeat him would soon be completed. But the human cost of actually building it was staggering, and it fell disproportionately upon men whose names were left entirely out of the historical record. The dream of a single country stretching unbroken from the Atlantic to the Pacific depended entirely on one nearly impossible promise: a transcontinental railway. Building the Canadian Pacific Railway meant blasting a physical path directly through the unforgiving Rocky Mountains, and the overwhelming majority of that dangerous work fell to thousands of Chinese laborers, who were paid dramatically less than their counterparts and died in genuinely staggering numbers as a result. When the famous last spike was finally driven into place in 1885, the surviving photographs captured a cluster of smiling officials dressed in fine coats. The men who had contributed the most and lost the most in making that celebratory moment possible were almost entirely absent from the frame. The railway was, in complete fairness, a genuinely staggering engineering undertaking, one designed to physically bind the country together and to honor the promise that had originally lured the far western territories into joining Confederation in the first place. The federal government committed to constructing a continuous line of steel across thousands of kilometers of some of the most brutal terrain found anywhere on the continent: endless dense forests, wide open prairies, and worst of all, the towering, seemingly impassable wall of the Rocky Mountains. It was the kind of massive project that looked nearly impossible on paper, and the actual reality of building it proved even harder than the paper suggested. The mountain sections proved by far the deadliest. Cutting a railway line through solid rock during that era meant hand-drilling holes and packing them with highly volatile explosives, including nitroglycerin, which had an alarming and well-documented tendency to detonate at the slightest unexpected provocation. Workers hung precariously off sheer cliff faces, bored directly through mountainsides, and labored constantly through rockslides, avalanches, and frequent fatal accidents. And the men performing the most dangerous portions of this work, in the most dangerous locations, were overwhelmingly Chinese laborers, brought in by the thousands specifically, because they would work for a fraction of what other laborers were paid. The arithmetic of their treatment remains genuinely grim. They received roughly half the wages paid to other workers for performing identical backbreaking labor. They were consistently assigned the most hazardous jobs available. They were frequently left to fend entirely for themselves regarding food, shelter, and basic medical care. And they died in appalling numbers from explosions, from rockslides, from disease, and from the sheer accumulated physical punishment of the working conditions. It's frequently and soberingly noted that roughly one worker died for nearly every mile of the most difficult mountain stretches. Many were simply buried where they fell, their names left entirely unrecorded, their families an entire ocean away and never properly informed. The final insult arrived only after the grueling work was complete. Having relied on this labor force to finish a project the country genuinely could not have completed without it, the federal government promptly turned around and imposed a punishing head tax specifically targeting Chinese immigrants, deliberately designed to discourage further immigration, and later moved to exclude Chinese immigrants almost entirely through additional legislation. The very people who had helped physically stitch the country together with their own blood were told, in effect, that they were no longer wanted here at all. It's a genuinely shameful sequence of events, and it should be remembered honestly as exactly that. When the ceremonial last spike was finally driven into the ground to mark the railway's completion, it became one of the most famous photographs in the entire nation's history. There stands a cluster of dignified, bearded gentlemen in fine coats, the financiers and government officials gathered proudly around their great collective achievement. And here is the quiet, damning detail worth sitting with. The Chinese laborers, without whose extraordinary sacrifice the mountains would never have been conquered at all, are essentially nowhere to be found anywhere in that celebrated photograph. They built the single hardest portion of the entire dream, and then they were quite literally cropped out of its most triumphant moment. The railway accomplished precisely what it was meant to do. It bound the country together from sea to sea and made the modern nation physically possible for the very first time. But the true cost of that achievement was paid disproportionately by men whose contribution was ignored for far too long, and whose story deserves to be properly told every single time that famous spike is mentioned in the history books. That same railway, and the country it helped create, would soon carry an entirely new wave of dreamers in a completely different direction, chasing the oldest temptation known to humanity, the glint of gold at the bottom of a frozen creek. In 1896, gold was discovered in a remote creek in the Yukon, and news of the find detonated across the entire world almost instantly. Within just 2 years, tens of thousands of hopeful prospectors abandoned their ordinary lives entirely and set off for the Klondike, most of them with absolutely no real idea what they were actually walking into. The journey alone proved brutally difficult, requiring each individual prospector to haul roughly a full ton of supplies over frozen mountain passes just to be legally permitted through. Boomtowns like Dawson City exploded into full existence almost overnight. For one brief, feverish moment, the frozen far north became one of the most talked about places anywhere on Earth before the gold, and the crowds inevitably moved on elsewhere. Gold fever is a genuinely strange affliction, and it has a curious way of gripping people who really ought to know better. When word finally reached the outside world that genuine fortunes were being pulled directly from creek beds in the Yukon, the public reaction bordered on outright mass hysteria. Office clerks quit their stable jobs on the spot. Shopkeepers abandoned businesses they'd spent years building. People with absolutely no relevant wilderness skills, no prior experience whatsoever, and no realistic hope of actual success, sold off everything they owned, and set off for a frozen, remote corner of the map that most of them couldn't have located on a globe a year earlier. The dream of easy riches has always possessed a strange ability to switch off the part of the human brain responsible for basic common sense. The trouble was that the Klondike region proved almost impossibly remote and monstrously difficult to actually reach. The classic route required these so-called stampeders to sail north and then physically haul their own gear over brutal mountain passes just to reach the headwaters of the rivers leading toward the actual gold fields. And the authorities, sensibly unwilling to let a mass of completely unprepared people simply starve to death in the wilderness, imposed a strict requirement. Before you were permitted through the mountain passes into the interior, you had to be carrying roughly a full year's worth of supplies, approximately 1 ton of goods per person. Let that figure really sink in for a moment. 1 full ton per individual person, and there were no trucks available, no pack animals for the vast majority, just your own 2 legs and your own aching back. So the stampeders climbed the mountain pass over and over again, carrying only a portion of their required supplies on each individual trip, cashing the load at the summit and trudging back down for yet another round. The famous surviving photographs of the Chilkoot Pass show an unbroken black line of humanity, thousands upon thousands of people crawling steadily up an impossibly steep, snow-covered slope like a column of ants, one agonizing step at a time. It could easily take dozens of separate trips and multiple weeks of grueling labor just to get one person's full ton of supplies successfully over the summit. Many simply gave up right there on the mountainside. For those who did eventually make it through, the boomtowns awaited them. Dawson City ballooned rapidly from essentially nothing into a bustling settlement of tens of thousands of people, complete with saloons, dance halls, and prices so wildly inflated that a single fresh egg or an ordinary nail could cost a genuine small fortune. It became a place where a lucky prospector might get spectacularly rich overnight and lose every bit of it again by the following morning, where the mud was already legendary and the entertainment came at a steep price. For one brief, glittering moment, It was among the most talked about places on the entire planet. Here's the genuinely cruel punchline to the whole affair. By the time most of the exhausted stampeders finally arrived, having sold off everything they owned and very nearly killed themselves in the process of getting there, the best and most productive claims had already been staked out by the locals who'd arrived first. The overwhelming majority of those who made this desperate journey found absolutely no gold at all. Many simply turned around and headed home, poorer than when they'd left, having gained nothing but a dramatic story and a permanently sore back for their troubles. The gold fever burned intensely hot, and then, almost as quickly as it had first ignited, moved on entirely to the next rumor somewhere else. Dawson City steadily emptied out. The frozen north gradually returned to its accustomed quiet. But not every mystery held within that vast frozen wilderness could be so neatly explained, and some of the strangest tales it holds concern the things that vanished into the ice and never came back out. In 1845, a British expedition led by Sir John Franklin sailed deep into the Canadian Arctic in search of a fabled Northwest Passage, and then simply vanished without a trace. 2 fully equipped ships and all 129 crew members were swallowed whole by the ice. For well over a century afterward, the ultimate fate of this expedition remained one of history's great unsolved cold cases, painstakingly pieced together only from scattered physical relics and Inuit oral testimony that was, for far too long, tragically dismissed and ignored by outside investigators. Then, in the 2010s, using that very same indigenous knowledge that had been available all along, modern search teams finally located both lost ships, remarkably well preserved on the floor of the frigid Arctic Sea. The expedition had originally set out with tremendous, almost arrogant confidence. 2 sturdy ships, specially reinforced against the crushing pressure of Arctic ice, packed with the most advanced technology available at the time, and carrying provisions intended to last for several years if necessary. Crewed by experienced sailors, all operating under a celebrated and respected commander. They sailed off with every intention of finally conquering the fabled Northwest Passage, that legendary sea route through the top of the continent that European explorers had been chasing for literal centuries. The entire enterprise fairly radiated with confident Victorian certainty, and then it simply disappeared entirely. The ships were spotted briefly by European whaling vessels early in the voyage, and after that nothing. Complete silence. When years passed without a single word of news, a substantial wave of search expeditions was launched to locate them, some funded directly by the British Navy, others funded by Franklin's own remarkably determined widow. These search parties crisscrossed the Arctic for literal decades. And while they did succeed in mapping a great deal of previously unknown territory in the process, they kept turning up only scattered fragments. A handful of graves discovered on a bleak, isolated island, some abandoned equipment, and eventually a single scribbled note left tucked beneath a small pile of stones, revealing that Franklin himself had already died, and that the surviving crew members had abandoned their ice-locked ships in a desperate attempt to march overland to safety. And then once again, nothing but scattered grim clues. The evidence that did eventually emerge painted a genuinely horrifying picture of a slow, agonizing end. The physical evidence strongly suggested the surviving men had succumbed gradually to extreme cold, starvation, and disease as they struggled desperately across the frozen wilderness, hauling heavy boats and personal belongings, dying one by one along the way. There were even indications, deeply shocking to sensitive Victorian sensibilities back home, that the final surviving members had eventually resorted to cannibalism in their absolute last extremity. It was, in every sense, a story of total, catastrophic failure, of supremely confident men utterly defeated by an unforgiving environment they had badly, fatally underestimated. Here's the part that genuinely needs to be stated clearly, because it matters enormously. All along, The Inuit people who actually lived in that region possessed detailed knowledge of exactly what had happened to the expedition. They had personally encountered some of the desperate survivors during their final march. They knew precisely where various events had occurred, and they had faithfully passed this knowledge down through their own oral traditions across multiple generations. For the longest time, the outside European searchers largely dismissed or entirely ignored this indigenous testimony, considering it inherently unreliable, when in fact it turned out to be remarkably, almost perfectly accurate. A tremendous amount of ongoing suffering and confusion could have been resolved far sooner had the European newcomers simply chosen to listen to the people who actually possessed genuine knowledge of the land. The eventual resolution, when it finally arrived, proved this exact point completely. In the 2010s, modern search teams working closely alongside Inuit knowledge and carefully preserved oral history finally located both lost ships resting on the sea floor, astonishingly well preserved by the frigid Arctic water. The wrecks were discovered in locations entirely consistent with what Inuit oral traditions had been saying all along. A mystery that had endured unsolved for well over a century was finally cracked wide open, in very large part, by finally honoring knowledge that had been freely offered from the very beginning. The story stands today as both a haunting tragedy and a quiet, important lesson. The Arctic simply does not care about confidence, or advanced technology, or the reputation of your empire back home. And the people who have actually lived in a place for thousands of years generally know things genuinely worth hearing. But the frozen north still had one more strange character waiting patiently in its shadows. A man who was never truly lost, but who firmly refused to be found. In the winter of 1932, a mysterious individual calling himself Albert Johnson triggered one of the strangest manhunts in all of Canadian history. Following a dispute in the remote Northwest Territories, he opened fire on approaching authorities and then fled directly into the frozen wilderness, launching a pursuit that would ultimately stretch on for more than a month across some of the harshest terrain found anywhere on the continent. He crossed entire mountain ranges in temperatures far below freezing, evaded seasoned, experienced trackers with genuinely uncanny skill, and even managed to outrun an airplane specifically brought in to locate him. To this very day, nobody is entirely certain who he truly was or where he originally came from. He remains, quite literally, a man without a confirmed name. The whole strange affair began with something almost entirely mundane. A quiet, deeply standoffish loner had arrived in the region and built himself a small, isolated cabin. Complaints eventually reached local authorities that he was interfering with other trappers' lines, and so a single officer was dispatched to have a word with him about it. Johnson refused to even open his cabin door. When authorities returned later with a proper warrant and a small handful of additional men, the situation escalated with startling speed. Johnson opened fire directly through the closed door, seriously wounding one of the approaching officers. And with that single violent act, a fairly minor complaint about trapping territory transformed instantly into a full-blown wilderness manhunt. What followed was, by any measure, genuinely astonishing. This single, isolated man, holed up defensively in his cabin, managed to hold off an entire group of officers during a siege, even successfully withstanding an attempt to blast him out using dynamite. When authorities finally managed to breach the cabin, he was already gone, having somehow slipped away undetected into the depths of the brutal Arctic winter. And so began the extended pursuit. In the dead of the coldest possible season, across frozen mountains and rivers, in temperatures that could easily kill an unprepared man within mere hours. Here's the detail that truly elevates this story from a simple criminal case into a genuine legend. Johnson proved to be extraordinarily, almost supernaturally capable in that brutal terrain. He moved with incredible speed and remarkable cunning. He deliberately backtracked repeatedly to confuse his pursuing trackers. He climbed directly over an entire mountain range in the absolute depths of winter, a feat widely considered nearly impossible, specifically to throw off the chase entirely. He survived alone out there, hunted relentlessly, with no fire to give away his exact position, for multiple weeks, in conditions actively trying to kill him at every turn. Whoever this man actually was, he was clearly no ordinary drifter. He possessed skills strongly suggesting a serious, mysterious background of some kind. The manhunt eventually grew into a genuine nationwide sensation. It became one of the very first cases in which authorities brought in an airplane specifically to help track down a fugitive, using it to scout his trail from above and to ferry additional men and supplies quickly across the vast terrain. The very idea of a single man on foot being actively pursued by aircraft across the Arctic captured the public's imagination completely, and radio broadcasts carried the unfolding drama to a thoroughly fascinated national audience. The entire country followed along closely as the chase dragged on for weeks, and the elusive trapper stubbornly refused to be caught. It finally ended in a violent shootout on a frozen river, where Johnson was ultimately killed after wounding yet another one of his determined pursuers. And that, you might reasonably assume, would be the moment the mystery was finally solved. Instead, it only deepened further. When authorities carefully examined his body and personal belongings afterward, they found no identification papers whatsoever, nothing reliable that could definitively reveal who this man actually was. The name Albert Johnson was almost certainly a complete alias. Every subsequent effort to trace his true identity, continuing right up through modern forensic attempts using contemporary DNA analysis, has never produced a definitive answer. So he remains, to this day, a genuine enigma frozen permanently into the historical record. A man of entirely unknown origin, uncanny wilderness skill, and inexplicable ferocity, who fought and ran and ultimately died in the Arctic winter, taking the secret of his own true name with him into the ice forever. Not every mystery of the North gets neatly solved. Some simply get colder. In April of 1917, on a muddy, shell-torn ridge in northern France, the 4 separate divisions of the Canadian Corps fought together as a single unified force for the very first time. The Battle of Vimy Ridge was a location where several much larger armies had already attempted an assault and failed completely, and the cost of the eventual Canadian victory was heavy, with thousands of young men killed or wounded across just a matter of days. And yet they succeeded where other, larger forces could not. For a country still actively discovering its own national identity, this victory came to be widely seen as a defining moment, a place where many genuinely felt Canada had stepped onto the world stage in its own right, at a terrible and thoroughly unforgettable price. By this particular point in the First World War, Vimy Ridge had already become a byword for pure slaughter. It was a long, heavily fortified height held firmly by the German army, and it dominated the entire surrounding landscape below. Previous attempts by other Allied armies to capture it had failed at absolutely appalling cost, tens of thousands of casualties, with essentially nothing meaningful to show for the sacrifice. The ridge was widely considered by many military planners to be very nearly unassailable, which made the difficult task eventually handed to the Canadian Corps a genuinely daunting one indeed. What the Canadians did differently is a genuinely important part of this story. Rather than simply hurling exhausted men directly at entrenched enemy positions and hopping for the best, Canadian planners prepared for the assault with truly meticulous care. Ordinary soldiers were briefed in extraordinary, granular detail about their specific individual objectives, so that even if their commanding officers fell in battle, ordinary enlisted men would still know exactly what to do and precisely where to go next. They rehearsed the entire planned assault repeatedly on full-scale physical models of the actual terrain, constructed well behind the front lines. They dug extensive tunnel networks to move troops safely forward without exposure. and they carefully coordinated their advance alongside a creeping curtain of artillery fire, a moving wall of controlled explosions that the advancing infantry followed closely across the shattered battlefield. The entire approach was disciplined, genuinely innovative, and thoroughly professional. The attack began in the pre-dawn cold of an April morning, amid sleet and thick mud, and all 4 Canadian divisions went forward together in a coordinated assault. The fighting itself was ferocious, and the physical conditions amounted to an absolute nightmare of freezing mud and churned, cratered earth. But the careful advance preparation ultimately paid off. Position by position, the Canadians steadily took the ridge, achieving in a matter of days something that larger, more experienced armies had previously failed to accomplish at all. It was, by the brutal standards of that particular war, a genuinely remarkable and hard-won achievement. It must never be dressed up as anything purely glorious, though, because the price paid was absolutely terrible. Thousands of young men were killed, and thousands more seriously wounded, across those few brutal days on that single muddy slope. Every single one of them was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody who had crossed an entire ocean and would either never come home again, or would return home permanently broken. A genuine victory it may well have been, but it was written in an enormous quantity of spilled blood, and any honest retelling of this story has to hold both of these truths simultaneously. The deeper, lasting significance emerged afterward, in how the country came to understand what had actually happened there. For the very first time, divisions raised from every single part of the young nation had fought side by side as one unified Canadian force, and had triumphed decisively where the great established military powers had previously stumbled badly. Many Canadians came to genuinely feel that their country had, on that single ridge, proven something important both to itself and to the wider world, that it was not merely a colonial appendage of the British Empire, but a genuine nation possessing its own capabilities and its own distinct identity, forged directly through shared wartime sacrifice. A popular saying eventually arose that Canada went up that ridge as a loose collection of separate colonies and came back down as a unified country. Whether or not one fully accepts that particular framing, the loss was entirely real, and the resulting pride was entirely real as well, and both endure powerfully to this day. And it turned out that this same terrible war would touch the country in one more devastating way that very same year, not on some distant foreign battlefield, but directly in a harbor back home. On the morning of December the 6th, 1917, in the busy harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia, two ships collided directly with one another. One of these vessels happened to be carrying a completely full cargo of wartime military explosives. The resulting blast turned out to be the largest man-made explosion the entire world had ever witnessed before the dawn of the atomic age. In a single devastating instant, entire residential neighborhoods were flattened completely. Roughly 2,000 people lost their lives, and thousands more were seriously injured, many of them permanently blinded by flying shards of glass. An entire city was devastated in one single, shattering moment. In the chaotic aftermath, help poured in rapidly from near and far, and one particular gesture of profound gratitude would go on to echo for more than a full century afterward. Halifax, at that point in history, was one of the most vital wartime ports anywhere on the eastern seaboard, its harbor constantly crowded with ships gathering together to cross the Atlantic in protected convoys. On that particular December morning, a French cargo vessel, absolutely packed to the brim with high explosives destined for the European front, was making its careful way through the narrow harbor channel. Coming in the opposite direction was a Norwegian relief ship. Through a series of unfortunate miscommunications and misjudged maneuvers between the two crews, the vessels collided directly. The impact itself wasn't immediately catastrophic, but it set the explosive-laden ship ablaze, and that turned out to be an entirely different matter altogether. The burning ship drifted slowly toward the shoreline, and a curious crowd gradually gathered to watch the unusual spectacle unfold. People stopped what they were doing on the streets. Dock workers looked up from their labor. Children pressed their faces excitedly against the windows of nearby homes and schoolrooms to get a better look at the burning vessel out in the harbor. Almost none of these onlookers had any idea whatsoever what that particular ship was actually carrying, or that they were, in effect, watching the lit fuse of an enormous bomb burn steadily down before their very eyes. This remains one of the most heartbreaking details of the entire tragedy, this innocent crowd of curious onlookers, drawn in purely by fascination. Then it exploded. The resulting blast was so immense that it's genuinely difficult to convey its scale in words. It instantly obliterated a huge swath of the city, flattening buildings outright, hurling heavy debris across enormous distances, and generating a powerful shockwave that swept violently through the entire harbor. The ship itself was essentially vaporized, its fragments flung far and wide across the region. Windows shattered across the entire city and well beyond its limits. And it was precisely those shattered windows that caused so much of the resulting human tragedy, because so many people had been standing directly in front of them, watching the fire. Countless survivors were permanently blinded or terribly injured by the sudden storm of flying glass. Roughly 2,000 people were killed in the disaster, and many thousands more were seriously injured. As if the horror of that single morning weren't already enough, a severe blizzard descended upon the ruined city the very next day, burying both the wreckage and many of the surviving injured under heavy snow, severely hampering the desperate rescue efforts already underway, and adding bitter cold and additional misery to a population already in complete shock. Families searched frantically through the rubble for missing loved ones. Local hospitals were completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of injured. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the very worst disasters the country had ever endured, a terrible wound inflicted not by any enemy attack, but by a tragic accident occurring right at home. And yet, out of that immense devastation came a genuinely powerful demonstration of basic human decency. Aid began pouring in almost immediately from surrounding communities and from much further afield as well. Relief trains were quickly dispatched. Medical teams were rapidly mobilized. Supplies and emergency funding were gathered from all directions. In the very depths of a catastrophe, this rapid response from ordinary people rushing to help complete strangers offered a fragile but genuine light against the surrounding darkness. The city itself would take years to fully rebuild, and the physical and human scars would linger for multiple generations afterward. But one particular act of kindness during those grim early days planted a seed that has been quietly blooming ever since, an annual gesture of thanks that crosses an international border to this very day. It remains one of the gentlest ongoing traditions found anywhere in North America, and it grew directly out of the ashes of that terrible morning. When the Halifax explosion tore the city apart in 1917, one of the very first places to rush emergency aid, doctors, medical supplies, and money was the city of Boston in the neighboring United States. Halifax never forgot that particular kindness. And so, for decades now, the province of Nova Scotia has carefully selected and cut down one of its finest evergreen trees and sent it south each and every year as a Christmas gift to the people of Boston. It stands proudly every December as a glowing thank you note, given quietly and faithfully across multiple generations, crossing an international border each time. In the chaotic hours immediately following the explosion, while Halifax lay buried in rubble, blanketed under fresh snow, and utterly overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, word of what had happened raced quickly down the eastern coastline. Boston, several hundred kilometers to the south, didn't hesitate for even a moment. Within a single day, the city had organized a full relief effort, and a train loaded with doctors, nurses, medical supplies, and emergency funding was already rolling northward directly through a fierce winter storm toward the shattered city. They pushed determinedly through the blizzard conditions to reach a place full of complete strangers who badly needed their help, and they arrived fully ready to work. Think carefully about what that response actually meant on the ground in Halifax. Local hospitals were completely flooded with injured patients, and there simply weren't enough trained hands available to treat everyone, especially given the enormous number of people suffering severe eye injuries from all the flying glass. The medical teams arriving from Boston and the surrounding region rolled up their sleeves immediately and joined the desperate relief effort, setting up emergency care stations, performing critical surgeries, and helping to organize relief for a population left in profound collective shock. In the very darkest moment of the city's entire history, meaningful help had arrived quickly from across an international border, generously, and without ever being asked twice. Halifax remembered this kindness. And here's the part that makes this particular story so genuinely wonderful. The city didn't just remember with a simple plaque or a single one-time thank you gesture. It chose to remember with an annual living gift instead. Some years after the disaster, the province formally began the tradition of sending a magnificent Christmas tree to Boston as a token of enduring, permanent gratitude. And in the modern era, this practice has become a formal, deeply cherished yearly event. Every single year, a splendid evergreen tree, often standing many stories tall, is carefully selected, cut down, and transported south to be raised in a place of genuine honor in Boston, where it's beautifully lit for the entire holiday season. The selection process for the tree itself is treated with real care, and even a degree of formal ceremony. Foresters actively seek out a specimen genuinely worthy of the honor, and the chosen tree receives a proper, respectful send-off before beginning its long journey across the international border. When it finally arrives in Boston, it's erected in a prominent public location and formally lit during a public celebration, shining brightly out over the city through the darkest, coldest weeks of the entire year. For the people of Boston, it has become a beloved fixture of the holiday season. For Nova Scotia, it represents a promise kept faithfully, year after year, without fail. What's genuinely moving about this particular tradition is its sheer, stubborn consistency over time. This was never a debt that was legally owed to anyone, nor a favor that ever demanded formal repayment. It's simply a community that once received extraordinary kindness during its absolute worst hour, and who decided, as a matter of enduring principle, that they would never allow that original gesture to be forgotten. Decades have passed. Entire generations have turned over completely. The people who personally lived through the original explosion are almost all gone now, and still, that tree travels south every single year without fail. A quiet, glowing act of gratitude that has genuinely outlived nearly everyone who personally witnessed the tragedy that originally started it. It's a rare and genuinely lovely thing, a simple thank you that refuses to ever expire. From one of the very worst disasters imaginable grew one of the warmest ongoing traditions found anywhere on the entire continent. And speaking of remarkable gifts, this country has given to the wider world. One of the greatest among them came not from any tragedy at all, but from a modest research laboratory where a small team was about to snatch dying children back from the very edge of death itself. In the early 1920s, a diagnosis of severe diabetes was very often, quite literally, a death sentence, especially for children. Then, in a modest laboratory at the University of Toronto, a research team including a young surgeon named Frederick Banting and a student assistant named Charles Best managed to successfully isolate insulin and prove definitively that it could save human lives. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Children who had been visibly wasting away, slipping quietly towards certain death, were revived almost overnight. And in a move that genuinely stunned the entire world of medicine, the discoverers chose to sell the patent for the price of $1, believing firmly that something so vital to human survival should belong freely to everyone. To fully understand the weight of this decision, you first have to understand just how utterly hopeless a diagnosis of severe diabetes truly was before insulin existed. A child diagnosed with the severe form of this disease faced a genuinely grim and painfully short future. The only available treatment at the time was an extreme starvation diet, a desperate attempt to keep the patient alive just a little bit longer by feeding them almost nothing at all, which meant that many patients wasted away to skin and bone, even as the underlying disease continued consuming them from within. Parents were forced to watch helplessly as their children slowly faded away, with medicine able to offer little more than a brief, miserable delay before the inevitable. It was quite simply a slow-motion death sentence. The eventual breakthrough came from a determined and somewhat unlikely research team. Banting himself was a young surgeon with a promising idea but not much of an established research reputation, who nevertheless managed to persuade a senior university professor to lend him laboratory space, some experimental animals, and a single student assistant for the summer months. That student happened to be Charles Best. Working through an unbearably hot Toronto summer in genuinely cramped laboratory conditions, the two men set about attempting to isolate the specific substance produced naturally by the pancreas that regulates blood sugar levels, a substance that had frustratingly eluded professional researchers for years beforehand. It was painstaking, deeply frustrating work, and it very nearly failed to succeed at all. But succeed it eventually did. With the crucial additional help of other researchers who joined the effort specifically to help purify the resulting extract, they eventually produced something genuinely viable for testing. And when they administered it to a dying teenage boy, the observed effect was absolutely astonishing. His blood sugar level dropped significantly, his overall condition improved rapidly, and a child who had been sitting at death's door began visibly recovering. Word of this success spread quickly, and soon patients who had already been essentially written off, severely emaciated and slipping into comas, were being brought back to life one after another. There are documented accounts of entire hospital wards full of dying diabetic children being systematically treated one after another, with the very first child injected already showing signs of recovery before doctors had even finished treating the last patient in line. It genuinely reads like an outright miracle, and to those who personally witnessed it unfold, it very nearly was exactly that. Then came the decision that elevates this entire story from merely a great scientific achievement into something genuinely noble. The discovery itself was worth an absolutely unimaginable fortune. Whoever ultimately controlled the commercial rights to insulin could have effectively named their own price to a world absolutely full of desperate, dying patients. And the discoverers, fully understanding exactly what they now held in their hands, deliberately chose to give it away instead. They sold the patent to their own university for the purely symbolic sum of $1 single, insisting firmly that a discovery this essential to basic human life should never become a source of private profit. It belonged, they firmly believed, to absolutely everyone who genuinely needed it. That single decision has echoed steadily down through the following century. Insulin has since kept countless millions of people alive who would otherwise have died tragically young, transforming what was once an inevitably fatal condition into a fully manageable one. It stands today as one of the single most significant medical breakthroughs of the entire modern age, and its humble origin in a modest Toronto laboratory, driven forward by one stubborn young surgeon and his summer research assistant, remains a genuine and enduring source of national pride. It's a story of science at its very best and most humane. And it fits neatly into a certain recurring pattern found throughout this country's history. Quiet, principled decisions that end up changing lives far beyond its own borders. Another such quietly principled decision, arising around that very same era, would go on to answer a question so genuinely absurd it's difficult to believe it ever seriously needed asking in the first place. Were women, legally speaking, even considered full persons under the law? It's a genuinely startling thought today. But for a substantial stretch of Canadian legal history, women were not formally considered legal persons under the law, at least not in the specific sense that would have permitted them to hold the country's highest appointed government offices. In 1929, a group of 5 determined women from Alberta, remembered collectively today as the Famous Five, carried this seemingly absurd legal question all the way through the highest available courts. The final ruling ultimately declared, at long last, that yes, women were indeed persons in the full and complete legal meaning of that word. It was a decision that seems glaringly, almost embarrassingly obvious by today's standards, and yet was considered quietly revolutionary at the time it was actually handed down. Let's sit for a moment with the sheer strangeness of the underlying legal premise here. The entire matter hinged on the precise wording of an old constitutional document, which specified that qualified persons could be formally appointed to the Senate, the country's unelected appointed upper legislative house. The genuine legal question that arose was whether the specific word persons, as actually used within that founding document, included women at all. And the shocking, official answer, according to the legal authorities of that particular day, was no. Women, it was formally argued, simply did not count as legal persons for the specific purposes of holding that particular government office. It's the kind of legal reasoning that sounds almost like deliberate satire today, except that it was treated with complete and deadly seriousness at the time, and it carried very real practical consequences. Enter the Famous Five, a group of 5 highly accomplished women from Alberta who had, quite understandably, had more than enough of this particular nonsense. They were activists, social reformers, and prominent public figures who had already spent years actively campaigning for the rights and general welfare of women and children across the country. Led by the formidable Emily Murphy, who had herself served as the very first female magistrate anywhere in the entire British Empire, and who had subsequently had her own legal authority directly challenged specifically on the grounds that she supposedly wasn't a legal person at all. They collectively decided to force the underlying question once and for all. They formally petitioned to have the country's highest court definitively rule on whether or not women were genuinely included within that fateful legal word. The initial answer they received was thoroughly crushing. The country's own Supreme Court carefully considered the entire matter and ultimately ruled directly against them, concluding formally that no, the word persons, as used in that old founding document, did not, in fact, include women at all. Try to imagine the sheer insult embedded in that ruling, having your own nation's highest court solemnly declare, on the official record, that you are not, in the relevant legal sense, actually considered a person. But the Famous Five were not finished pursuing the matter, not in that particular era. There remained one further court of appeal still available to them, a judicial body located across the ocean in Britain, and they took their case all the way there as a final resort. And there, at long last, basic common sense finally prevailed. The British Judicial Committee overturned the earlier Canadian ruling entirely, issuing a landmark decision on the matter. In wonderfully pointed, memorable language, the judgment observed that excluding women from full public life represented nothing more than a relic left over from a distinctly more barbarous age, and it declared unambiguously that the word persons did indeed include members of both sexes equally. Women were legally persons. It should genuinely never have been in serious doubt in the first place, and yet having this fact stated so plainly by the highest available legal authority represented a genuine and meaningful turning point. The door to the Senate, and to a fuller and more complete public life generally, was now formally and legally open. The victory itself was entirely real, though it's worth being fully honest that it also remained genuinely incomplete in important ways. The ruling represented a significant milestone for many women, yet the broader ongoing march toward genuine equality for women of every background would continue for many more decades afterward, and in many important respects continues on to the present day. The members of the Famous Five themselves were, of course, very much products of their own particular era, holding certain views on other matters that have not all aged gracefully or well by modern standards. But the core achievement itself still stands firm. They forced an entire national legal system to formally state out loud, and permanently for the historical record, that women were indeed people. It remains a powerful reminder that some of history's most important battles are fought over things that later generations can scarcely even believe were ever seriously in question at all. Progress, genuine and lasting progress, was clearly possible during this particular era, and not all of that same era's enterprising activity was quite so high-minded or dignified. Some of it involved fast boats, moonlit nights, and an enormous quantity of illegal liquor. When the United States formally banned alcohol during its national era of prohibition, an enormous and thoroughly thirsty market suddenly appeared directly across the border, and enterprising Canadians proved more than happy to help meet that demand. Throughout the 1920s and well into the early 1930s, Canadian distilleries kept right on producing at full capacity, while a shadowy fleet of rum runners smuggled the finished liquor south by boat, by automobile, and along quiet back roads under cover of darkness. Small towns situated near the international border grew mysteriously wealthy almost overnight. Several of Canada's most famous liquor fortunes trace their origins directly back to this particular period, when the simple act of manufacturing a drink and moving it just a few miles south turned ordinary people into very wealthy and very discreet entrepreneurs. The overall setup was almost comically favorable for anyone willing to take the risk. To the south lay a vast nation that had formally decided, by federal law, that its citizens were no longer permitted to purchase or consume alcohol. And yet the citizens of that same nation remained, to put it as gently as possible, extremely and enduringly interested in drinking regardless. To the north lay a country where, in most provinces, manufacturing and selling alcohol remained perfectly legal throughout. All that stood between the eager supply and the desperate demand was a single international border. And borders, as any experienced smuggler will happily tell you, tend to function as more of a polite suggestion than an actual physical wall. The resulting opportunity was genuinely staggering, and human nature being exactly what it is, plenty of enterprising people rose eagerly to meet it. The methods employed were wonderfully varied and often remarkably ingenious. Along the various waterways, fast motorboats would load up with cases of liquor and slip quietly across lakes and rivers under cover of darkness, racing to deliver their valuable cargo to buyers waiting patiently on the far shore. On the overland routes, cars and trucks fitted with hidden compartments and specially reinforced suspensions would run their loads down quiet back roads, sometimes at genuinely high speed with pursuing authorities close behind. And during the depths of winter on the frozen lakes, some particularly daring individuals even drove fully loaded cars straight across the solid ice, an activity carrying a rather significant risk of a very cold and very permanent conclusion should the ice give way. The overall effect on these border communities was dramatic and impossible to hide from anyone paying attention. Sleepy little towns that had never previously had two coins to rub together suddenly found themselves flush with cash. New buildings went up rapidly. People who had previously been scraping by were suddenly, and rather suspiciously, doing remarkably well for themselves. Everyone in these communities knew, more or less, exactly where all this new money was actually coming from, and a great many people were entirely happy to simply look the other way, because a genuinely booming local economy has a well-documented way of softening even the firmest personal principles. It was, in every practical sense, a fairly open secret prosperity built directly on a product that happened to be illegal on the opposite side of a completely invisible line. At the larger commercial scale, this was also where some genuinely significant business fortunes were quietly made. The major established distilleries, operating entirely legally on their own side of the border, could hardly be blamed if their finished products happened to find their way south through various channels they officially knew absolutely nothing about. The overall demand was enormous. The resulting profits were immense. And some of the great commercial business empires that followed in later decades can trace their earliest and fastest growth directly back to precisely this thirsty, lucrative window of opportunity. It was, in every sense, something of a golden age for anyone actively involved in the business of making, moving, or quietly financing the movement of a simple alcoholic drink. Of course, it certainly wasn't all high spirits and easy money throughout this period. The lucrative trade inevitably attracted organized criminal elements. It fostered widespread corruption among officials on both sides of the border, and it could prove genuinely dangerous, involving violent hijackings and the ever-present risk of a fatal accident occurring on a dark road or thin, treacherous ice. But viewed today from a safe historical distance, there remains an undeniable romance to the whole era. This vivid image of fast boats gliding across moonlit water and cars flying down quiet back roads, all ultimately in service of getting a perfectly legal drink to people who had simply been forbidden one by their own government. When Prohibition finally ended for good, the entire party gradually wound down, the boats found other, more legitimate work, and the whole strange interlude slowly faded into regional folklore. It was a colorful chapter of genuine ingenuity and mischief. But that very same era also holds within it a story that begins in pure, innocent wonder and gradually curdles into something far more troubling. A story involving 5 identical little girls, born into a country that ultimately could not resist putting them on constant public display. In 1934, in rural Ontario, 5 identical baby girls were born to the Dion family. They were the very first known set of quintuplets to survive infancy anywhere in the world, and their arrival was celebrated globally as a genuine miracle of medicine and nature combined. But what happened to them next casts a genuinely long and troubling shadow. Government authorities eventually removed the 5 sisters entirely from their own parents' custody and placed them instead in a specially constructed compound, where members of the paying public were actively invited to come and observe the children through specially designed screened viewing areas. Millions of tourists ultimately came to see them. The children became, in effect, one of the era's biggest tourist attractions. Their story stands today as a sobering and important reminder of just how easily innocent public wonder can slide into outright exploitation, especially where vulnerable children are directly involved. The birth itself was, by the medical standards of that particular time, almost genuinely unbelievable. 5 baby girls, all of them identical, born prematurely inside a small rural farmhouse. And against truly overwhelming medical odds, every single one of them survived. In an era well before the modern medical advances that might make such a birth somewhat less astonishing today, this event was widely received as nothing short of a genuine wonder of the world. The 5 little girls, tiny and desperately fragile at birth, defied every reasonable medical expectation simply by managing to stay alive. Their remarkable story flashed rapidly around the entire globe, and a public genuinely hungry for good news during difficult economic times fell instantly and completely in love with them. And that, unfortunately, is precisely where the serious trouble began. The government authorities of the day formally decided that the girls' parents, a struggling rural farming family already raising several other children, were simply not fit to properly care for these 5 miraculous infants. The girls were consequently removed entirely from their family's legal custody and placed under the direct care of the state, alongside a dedicated team of physicians. A special purpose-built facility was constructed specifically to house them, ostensibly in order to protect their fragile health and to ensure their proper medical development, given how precious and vulnerable they were considered to be. On its face, this decision might have sounded like genuine concern for their overall welfare. In actual practice, it quickly became something far more disturbing. The compound where the 5 girls were subsequently raised functioned, in effect, as a continuous public exhibition. A dedicated viewing area was specifically constructed so that members of the visiting public could file past and openly watch the young sisters at play, observing them from behind specially designed one-way screening that allowed visitors to see the children clearly without the children ever being able to see them in return. And the paying public came in truly enormous numbers, millions of visitors over the following years, transforming a quiet rural farming area into one of the single most popular tourist destinations found anywhere on the entire continent. People traveled truly great distances specifically to gaze at 5 small girls through a viewing window. The overall scale of this spectacle is genuinely difficult to fully comprehend today. An entire local industry grew up rapidly around the 5 sisters. Their images were used extensively to sell all manner of commercial products. Souvenirs were actively hawked to the visiting crowds by the thousands. The surrounding area boomed economically almost entirely on the strength of this single attraction. These were, it's worth remembering plainly, not performers or willing public figures who had ever chosen any part of this arrangement for themselves. They were small children being raised in a completely artificial environment, put on constant display as the central exhibit in a commercial business that profited directly from their very existence. Whatever the original stated justifications may have been, the practical reality was that childhood itself had been quietly transformed into a paid public show. The long shadow cast by this experience fell across the remainder of these women's entire lives. Removed permanently from any normal family upbringing, raised instead as public curiosities on constant display, the 5 sisters carried the lasting consequences of that strange and profoundly lonely childhood for the rest of their days, and their later adult lives were marked by very real hardship and considerable personal sorrow. Over time, the entire affair came to be understood not as some heartwarming miracle after all, but rather as a genuine cautionary tale about the exploitation of vulnerable children, and about how easily a society's initial affection can curdle into something that treats human beings as mere attractions. It's a story that must be told with real care, because at its very heart are children who deserved far, far better treatment than they ultimately received, and it points directly toward a much larger and considerably more painful historical reckoning that Canada would eventually have to face. Some parts of any country's past must be spoken of plainly, honestly, and without any attempt whatsoever at lightness or humor. For more than a full century, Canada operated an extensive system of residential schools, into which Indigenous children were taken, very often forcibly, and permanently separated from their families, their languages, and their cultures. The harm inflicted within these institutions was profound and genuinely lasting, and its consequences continue to be carried today by survivors themselves and by their descendants. This is not, in any sense, a story of idle curiosity or historical intrigue. It is a matter demanding honest acknowledgement, careful listening, and an ongoing national reckoning that continues into the present day, one that must be approached with complete honesty and genuine care. The residential school system was established with an explicit and genuinely devastating underlying purpose. Its stated aim was the deliberate erasure of Indigenous identity, the intentional severing of children from absolutely everything that connected them to who they fundamentally were. Children were taken from their homes and communities, sometimes at very young ages indeed, and placed into institutions often located very far away from everything familiar to them. There, they were formally forbidden from speaking their own native languages, actively prevented from practicing their own cultural traditions, and systematically stripped of the cultural inheritance that was rightfully theirs by birth. The stated intention, expressed in the cold, bureaucratic language of official policy at the time, was to deliberately remake these children into something entirely different from what they and their families genuinely were. It represented, by clear design, a direct assault on an entire people's cultural continuity across successive generations. The physical conditions within many of these institutions were genuinely grievous. Children were frequently subjected to serious neglect, to inadequate food and basic care, and to abuse of numerous different kinds. Disease spread readily through overcrowded and poorly maintained facilities, and the resulting mortality rate among these children was, in far too many documented cases, genuinely appalling. Families were left without their own children, and children were left entirely without the love, protection, and sense of belonging that every single child fundamentally deserves. This suffering was not merely incidental or accidental. It flowed directly and predictably from a system that treated these children as subjects to be forcibly transformed, rather than as human beings deserving to be genuinely cherished and protected. The resulting wounds did not simply end when these schools finally closed their doors for good. The harm inflicted upon those who survived rippled outward and forward through subsequent time. The forced severing of language and culture created deeply painful gaps that many indigenous communities have had to fight hard to repair in the years since. The trauma experienced directly by survivors was, in many documented cases, carried forward into their own subsequent family lives, affecting the following generations in ways that are still being actively understood and addressed even today. This is precisely what is meant when people speak of intergenerational harm. The damage inflicted upon children long ago continues to be felt acutely by their own children, and by their children's children, even in the present day. In more recent years, the country has begun a difficult but genuinely necessary process of openly confronting this history. Survivors have courageously come forward to share their personal experiences publicly, insisting firmly that the full truth finally be heard and properly recorded. Formal efforts have been undertaken to thoroughly document exactly what happened, to openly acknowledge the wrongs committed, and to begin the long, difficult work of genuine reconciliation. The recovery and formal confirmation of unmarked graves at the sites of former residential schools has, in particular, brought renewed and deeply sober national attention to the true scale of this loss, and has significantly deepened the collective public understanding of what these institutions truly meant in practice. This is not a matter that can ever be neatly resolved or simply set aside. It represents an ongoing reckoning, and the appropriate response is not to search for convenient silver linings, but rather to listen carefully, to acknowledge honestly, and to actively support the efforts of indigenous communities as they lead this vital work of healing entirely on their own terms. The proper role of the rest of the country is to bear honest witness, to learn the full truth, and to hold that truth with all the seriousness it fundamentally deserves. We tell this particular story plainly because it is genuinely owed that level of honesty. And as we continue forward from here, we do so mindful that any nation's history holds all of these things simultaneously, the sorrowful alongside the surprising, and that properly acknowledging the former is an essential part of honoring the whole complete picture. Here's a fact guaranteed to lift the mood again, and it may genuinely surprise you. One of the two original creators of Superman, arguably the single most famous superhero ever conceived, was actually Canadian. The artist Joe Shuster grew up in Toronto before his family eventually relocated to the United States, where he and his writing partner dreamed up the Man of Steel together sometime in the 1930s. Look closely at Superman's fictional home city, along with its bustling newspaper setting, and you can still find quiet echoes of the Toronto that young Shuster personally knew as a boy. The character who eventually came to symbolize a certain brand of American heroism had, it turns out, a distinctly Canadian hand involved in his original creation. Superman remains about as instantly recognizable a figure as human culture has ever managed to produce. The flowing cape, the iconic crest on his chest, the ability to leap tall buildings and later to fly freely through the air. The entire modern template of the caped superhero essentially begins with him. He's been reimagined countless times across nearly a full century now, in comic books, on radio programs, on television, and across the biggest of movie screens. And he remains a towering cultural symbol of a certain enduring American ideal. So it's a genuinely delightful twist to discover that fully half of the creative partnership that originally dreamed him up was actually born and raised north of the border. Joe Shuster served as the artist of the creative duo, the one who gave Superman his actual visual form, and he spent his early childhood years growing up in Toronto. His family later relocated to the United States. As young men, he and writer Jerry Siegel together developed the character that would eventually make them both famous, though sadly not particularly wealthy for a very long time afterward, as the story of how they ultimately lost commercial control over their own creation is itself a fairly significant cautionary tale. But the key point for our purposes here is simply this. The pencil that first ever drew the world's most famous superhero was guided by a hand shaped, during its formative years, by a genuine Canadian childhood. And the traces of that particular childhood are still there, if you know exactly where to look for them. Superman's fictional home city, the great bustling metropolis where he fights crime and works his day job as a mild-mannered newspaper reporter, is widely understood to have drawn direct creative inspiration from the city's young Shuster personally knew growing up, and he himself later acknowledged that the Toronto of his youth genuinely informed his overall vision of the hero's urban world. The great fictional newspaper, where the hero's civilian alter ego is employed, is said to have been partly inspired by an actual Toronto newspaper that young Shuster once personally delivered as a paperboy. The genuine DNA of a Canadian city is quietly woven directly into the fabric of the world's most distinctly American myth. There's something wonderfully fitting about this particular fact, something that speaks directly to a recurring theme running throughout this country's broader cultural story. Canadians have developed an extraordinary habit of quietly creating, or substantially contributing to, things that the wider world then simply assumes are purely American in origin, and of doing so without ever making much of a fuss about it themselves. The nation exports enormous amounts of genuine talent and creativity, very often to its much larger southern neighbor, where that talent flourishes and becomes globally famous, its true origins gently forgotten along the way. Superman is perhaps the ultimate example of this pattern, a hero who stands for one particular country, but was actually co-created by a son of another. It's the kind of fact that makes you look at a familiar cultural icon just a little bit differently afterward. The next time that famous figure streaks dramatically across a movie screen, cape flying behind him, saving the day in his gleaming fictional city, you might spare a passing thought for a young boy back in Toronto, delivering newspapers door to door and quietly dreaming, whose imagination helped give the entire world its greatest hero. The world got Superman. Canada, characteristically, barely even mentioned that it had anything meaningfully to do with it. And remarkably, Superman isn't the only globally beloved creation this quietly inventive country casually tossed off and simply let others claim credit for. There's a certain wildly popular sport, played today in gymnasiums and arenas across the entire planet, that also began with a Canadian and with a single moment of pure improvisation. The wonderfully American-seeming sport of basketball was, in fact, invented by a Canadian as well. In the winter of 1891, a physical education instructor named James Naismith, originally from Ontario, was assigned the task of inventing an entirely new indoor game specifically to keep a group of restless students physically active through the long, cold winter months. He nailed an ordinary peach basket up onto a railing, wrote down a short list of basic rules, and almost entirely by accident, created one of the single most popular sports found anywhere on the planet. For quite some time afterward, someone actually had to fetch a physical ladder to retrieve the ball after every single successful shot, because nobody had yet thought to simply cut the bottom out of the basket. The specific problem Naismith had originally been assigned to solve was a genuinely practical one. He was working at a training school located in Massachusetts, and he'd been handed a fairly difficult assignment. There was a class of energetic young men who were rapidly going stir-crazy during the long, cold winter months, cooped up indoors with no particularly good outlet for burning off their excess physical energy. The existing indoor activities available simply weren't working, and previous instructors had already failed to keep this particular group properly engaged. Naismith was essentially instructed to invent something entirely new, a game that could reasonably be played indoors within a fairly confined space, without the physical roughness that made most other popular sports genuinely unsuitable for an indoor court. So he sat down and thought the entire problem through with real, deliberate care. He wanted a game built primarily around skill rather than sheer brute physical force, one that wouldn't inevitably descend into a bruising physical pileup. He reasoned that if the scoring goal itself were placed sufficiently high up, players would naturally have to aim with genuine finesse rather than simply charging directly at it, which would meaningfully cut down on unnecessary physical violence. He looked around the gymnasium for something suitable to serve as this elevated goal. And what he eventually found were a couple of ordinary peach baskets, which he promptly nailed up at either end of the gymnasium, at a height that has more or less endured, essentially unchanged, right up to the present day. He then wrote down his complete set of rules, a fairly short list of just over a dozen simple guidelines, and set his restless students loose to try out this brand new game for the very first time. That very first recorded match was, by all surviving accounts, a modest and somewhat genuinely chaotic affair, but the essential underlying idea clearly worked. The players took to it immediately. Word of this exciting new indoor game spread with genuinely surprising speed, carried along by enthusiastic students and instructors to other schools and cities, and it began its remarkable climb toward eventually becoming one of the most widely played sports found anywhere on Earth. Not a bad outcome at all for something originally dreamed up simply to solve an awkward winter scheduling headache. The particular detail about the peach baskets is the part that always brings a genuine smile to people's faces, because Naismith had used actual peach baskets, complete with their actual solid bottoms still intact. Every single time a player successfully scored a basket, the ball would simply come to rest snugly inside the basket itself. Play couldn't meaningfully continue until someone physically retrieved the ball, which in those very early days meant literally fetching a ladder, climbing up it, and manually fishing the ball back out by hand. Try to imagine the entire flow of a fast-paced game grinding to a complete halt after every single score, while someone climbs up a ladder to retrieve the ball. It took a fair amount of time before the wonderfully obvious innovation of simply cutting the bottom out of the basket occurred to anyone at all, at which point the game immediately became considerably faster and more fluid. From those genuinely humble peach baskets grew an eventual global phenomenon, a sport now played in schoolyards, local gymnasiums, and grand professional arenas absolutely everywhere around the world, generating passion and spectacle on a truly enormous scale. And at the very root of it all sits a thoughtful physical education instructor from rural Ontario, simply trying to keep some restless young men productively occupied through one particularly difficult winter, who ended up accidentally giving the entire world one of its favorite games. It's a genuinely fine thing to invent something that manages to endure across generations, but not every ambitious Canadian creation was ultimately allowed to survive. And one of the most heartbreaking chapters in this nation's long story of engineering ingenuity involves a truly magnificent machine that was carefully built, widely celebrated, and then deliberately, thoroughly destroyed. In the late 1950s, Canada built something genuinely ahead of its time, a sleek, delta-winged supersonic interceptor aircraft called the Avro Arrow. It was remarkably fast, technologically advanced, and by many contemporary accounts, genuinely world-leading in its capabilities, representing an enormous source of national pride and the culmination of work by thousands of brilliant aerospace engineers. Then, in 1959, the federal government abruptly canceled the entire program without warning. Not only were the existing completed aircraft scrapped entirely, but direct orders were given to destroy nearly everything else connected to the project. The remaining planes, all the technical blueprints, even the physical scale models used in testing. Talented engineers scattered abroad in search of new work, some of them eventually going on to make significant contributions to the American space program. The Aero became a lasting national what if, one that is still quietly mourned by many to this very day. For one brief, shining moment, the Aero represented a genuinely soaring national ambition made real. Here was a country that was not traditionally considered one of the world's great established aviation powers, successfully designing and building a genuinely cutting-edge military aircraft that could authentically compete with, and in certain respects even surpass, what the much larger established nations were producing at the time. The aircraft itself was visually stunning, all clean lines and elegantly swept-back wings, and it was engineered to fly at truly extraordinary speeds and altitudes in order to intercept incoming aerial threats. Thousands of dedicated engineers, technicians, and skilled workers poured their considerable talent and genuine pride directly into this ambitious project. It was precisely the kind of national endeavor that makes an entire country feel it can genuinely stand shoulder to shoulder among the established giants of the world. And then, quite suddenly, it was simply over. The government of the day made the difficult decision to cancel the entire program outright. The stated reasons involved a complicated tangle of rapidly soaring development costs, shifting contemporary military thinking about the diminishing strategic role of manned interceptor aircraft in an emerging age of guided missiles, and a series of hard-nosed political calculations made behind closed doors. There were genuine, legitimate arguments to be made regarding the mounting expense involved, and regarding whether the aircraft's originally intended strategic role was rapidly becoming obsolete. Governments cancel expensive projects fairly regularly, and reasonable, well-informed people can certainly debate whether this particular one should have been among them. That part of the story, taken entirely on its own, is simply the ordinary stuff of government budgets and shifting military strategy. But it was what happened immediately afterward that transformed a difficult financial decision into a genuine and lasting national heartbreak. The formal order given was not merely to end the program going forward, but to thoroughly and completely destroy absolutely everything connected to it. The magnificent aircraft that had already been fully built were unceremoniously cut up for scrap metal. The detailed technical blueprints and engineering documents were systematically destroyed. Even the physical scale models used throughout testing were specifically ordered to be smashed to pieces. It was almost as though the underlying goal had been to erase the Avro Aero from existence entirely, to deliberately leave almost nothing behind for posterity. To this very day, only a small handful of physical fragments survive anywhere scattered pieces of what had once been a genuine triumph of engineering, and the true underlying reasons for such total, deliberate destruction remain a subject of considerable bitter speculation among historians even now. The human cost involved only compounded this already significant loss. The sudden cancellation threw thousands of highly skilled aerospace workers out of steady employment in a single devastating stroke, effectively dispersing one of the most genuinely talented pools of aerospace engineering expertise the country had ever managed to assemble in one place. And here's the detail that particularly stings even now. A meaningful number of those brilliant, suddenly unemployed engineers, no longer needed at home, promptly took their extraordinary technical skills elsewhere entirely, including south of the border, where several went on to make genuinely significant contributions to the American space program and its ultimately successful effort to reach the moon. The country had carefully trained an entire generation of genuine aerospace geniuses, and then, in effect, simply handed them over to its much larger neighbor. The Arrow lives on today as one of the great enduring what-ifs of the national imagination. What might have been achieved had the program simply been allowed to continue unimpeded? Where might the country's entire aerospace industry have eventually gone as a result? These particular questions remain genuinely unanswerable today, which is precisely why they continue to endure in the popular imagination. It became a lasting symbol of genuine ambition realized and then inexplicably thrown away entirely, a symbol of a nation that reached for something truly remarkable, and then, for reasons still hotly argued over even today, chose to deliberately smash it to pieces instead. It remains genuinely mourned to this day, a beautiful machine that was carefully built to fly and was scarcely ever allowed to. From a national symbol that was ultimately lost forever, we come at last to a symbol that was instead embraced wholeheartedly, one that the country argued over with surprising passion before finally taking it firmly and permanently to heart. For nearly a full century following Confederation, Canada did not actually possess a truly distinctive national flag of its own, relying instead on various British symbols that many citizens increasingly felt no longer properly represented who they had genuinely become as a nation. In the mid-1960s, the country plunged headlong into a surprisingly fierce and prolonged national argument over precisely what its brand new flag should ultimately look like. This extended months-long clash of competing opinions is remembered today as the Great Flag Debate. Out of all that vigorous shouting and endless sketching, eventually emerged something wonderfully clean, bold, and instantly recognizable worldwide. A single stylized red maple leaf set against a plain white field, framed neatly on either side by broad vertical bars of red. First formally raised in 1965, this new flag went on to become one of the most beloved and universally recognizable national symbols found absolutely anywhere on the entire planet. It genuinely seems almost strange today to consider that this particular country, now so thoroughly identified worldwide with its iconic maple leaf, spent the entire first century of its national existence without any distinctive national flag to properly call its own. For many decades, the country simply made do with various banners based directly on British imperial emblems, flags that clearly reflected the nation's colonial origins and its lasting formal ties to the British Empire. For a very long time, this arrangement was simply accepted without much serious complaint. But as the nation gradually matured, developed an increasingly confident sense of its own distinct identity, and warmly welcomed people from an ever-widening variety of global backgrounds, more and more ordinary citizens began to feel that these old imperial symbols no longer properly captured who they had genuinely become as a people. It was time, many began to argue forcefully, for a brand new flag that was unmistakably and entirely their own. Getting there, however, proved to be anything but a simple or straightforward process. When the government of the day formally committed to finally adopting a new national flag once and for all, it inadvertently unleashed a public debate of genuinely startling intensity. This was most certainly not some polite, quiet disagreement of the gentle sort the country's international reputation might reasonably lead you to expect. It became a genuine, prolonged, and at times distinctly bitter national argument that thoroughly consumed the country's political life for many months on end. Public passions ran extraordinarily high on all sides of the issue. People felt very deeply about exactly what their new national flag should properly represent, and precisely what it should visually look like. At the very heart of this dispute lay, in a very real sense, a fundamental clash between the past and the future. On one side stood those who genuinely cherished the country's traditional historical ties to Britain, and who wanted a new flag that continued to honor that heritage, perhaps by retaining certain familiar imperial symbols in some form. On the opposing side stood those who wanted a genuinely clean break from the past entirely, a fresh design that belonged solely to the country itself, and that properly spoke to a new and confidently independent sense of national self. Countless different design proposals were put forward, debated at length, and ultimately rejected. Dedicated committees pored carefully over hundreds of sketches. Politicians argued passionately late into the night on multiple occasions. The entire affair became, in effect, a genuine marathon contest between competing visions for the true soul of the nation. Out of this lengthy and genuinely impassioned national process, a final design eventually emerged that has since become truly iconic in its elegant simplicity. A bold, stylized red maple leaf positioned at the very center of a clean white field, flanked on either side by broad vertical bars of red. The maple leaf itself had already long served as something of an informal, unofficial emblem of the country, and here it was formally elevated to sit at the very heart of the new national banner, clean, thoroughly modern, and entirely free of any borrowed imperial symbols whatsoever. It was distinctive, it was genuinely elegant, and it was unmistakably, completely its own creation. When this new flag was first officially raised in 1965, it marked a genuine and meaningful turning point for the entire nation. Whatever the sheer fury of the preceding debate that had produced it, the finished design was embraced with remarkable speed and genuine warmth by the Canadian public. It quickly became one of the single most recognizable national symbols found anywhere in the entire world, a simple red and white banner that people across the globe can now identify at an instant glance. Travelers came to wear it proudly on their backpacks and jackets. And at home, it steadily became a cherished emblem of a distinct and genuinely confident national identity. The country had argued long, hard, and passionately, and had ultimately ended up with a national symbol it genuinely, wholeheartedly loved. And so, from a misunderstood word spoken centuries ago, all the way to a beloved modern flag, the story finally comes full circle. A nation that so often built quietly, argued politely, and consistently ended up with symbols and achievements it could hold onto with genuine, well-earned pride. So there it finally is. An entire country's story, quietly waiting all along behind that famously polite smile and that colorful, distinctive currency. Tonight, you crossed the world's longest undefended international border and discovered something the glossy postcards never quite managed to mention. Vikings who simply shrugged their shoulders and calmly sailed back home. A nation permanently named after a small, honest misunderstanding. A humble fish that somehow built an entire empire. Gold that quietly broke countless men's hearts and emptied their pockets, and a single long walk through dense woods that genuinely helped save the outcome of a war. You met the voyageurs, singing steadily through their own sheer physical exhaustion. You met brave young women who crossed an entire ocean to build completely new lives from nothing. And you met freedom seekers, faithfully following the fixed North Star toward a border that finally meant they could never again be owned by another human being. You also sat patiently with the harder, more difficult chapters, the ones that genuinely demand honesty rather than a comfortable smile. Because any country's true and complete story holds all of this at once, the genuine sorrow alongside the genuine wonder, the things that were needlessly smashed to pieces, and the thing that is faithfully sent south every single Christmas, out of a gratitude that simply refuses to ever fade away. What lingers now, as the fan continues humming quietly and your eyes grow steadily heavier, is just how much of all this was built quietly, assembled patiently around a conference table, argued over politely, or simply given away for a single symbolic dollar because it was clearly the right thing to do. This was a country that, time and again, chose to talk things through rather than fight, chose to endure patiently rather than boast loudly, and chose to create genuine marvels it barely even bothered to take proper credit for afterward. So tonight, as you settle in deeper beneath your warm blankets, spare one last soft thought for the paddlers and the pioneers, the dreamers and the quiet survivors, the properly named and the sadly unthanked, all of whom helped shape this gentle, endlessly surprising place, one stubborn winter at a time. History, as it turns out, is rarely ever quite as quiet as it first appears on the surface. But you right now can be. Let your breathing slow completely. Let the cold stay safely outside your window, and drift off now, warm and entirely safe, into an easy, peaceful, dreamless sleep.